There is a moment near the end of Gravity Falls, in the final stretch of the second season, where a time traveler is sitting in the back of a baby's mouth. The baby is the size of a building, and the show is asking you, in complete sincerity, to accept that this is the lawful authority of the timeline. It is one of the funniest images in the entire series, and it is also, when you stop to think about it, one of the strangest. Because Gravity Falls is a children's cartoon that quietly built one of the most consistent and intricate time travel sandboxes on television, and then never stopped breaking its own rules in ways that almost nobody talks about. Tonight we are going through every paradox the show offers, every loop, every contradiction, every impossible object, every dream that contains itself, and we are taking our time with all of it. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, settle in, we will be here a while. And if you have not subscribed to Pine Hat yet, it really does help us keep making these. The first paradox is the simplest one, and it is also the one the show uses to teach you, very gently, that time travel inside Gravity Falls is going to be a real toy with real edges. It happens in the 9th episode of the first season, an episode called The Time Traveler's Pig, and the central object is a small gray device strapped to the wrist of a bald, bewildered figure named Blendin Blandin. He is not a villain in the conventional sense. He is a janitor of the timeline, a low-ranking employee of a future organization, sent back to fix small temporal anomalies, and the moment Dipper and Mabel get their hands on his device, the show makes a quiet promise. Time travel here will be physical, comedic, and consequential, and every wish you make will cost something. The paradox in this episode is the oldest one in the book. Dipper falls in love with a girl named Wendy. He loses his moment with her in a small, humiliating accident, and he uses the time machine to try again, and again, and again, and each time he tries to fix the moment, he changes it in some smaller, sadder way. The version of him watching from outside the loop is a paradox in himself, because he is a Dipper who knows what the other Dipper does not, who watches himself fail with a kind of helpless second-person tenderness, and who is, by the rules of any consistent timeline, not supposed to exist alongside the version he is rescuing. The show does not pretend to resolve this. It lets the two Dippers stand next to each other on screen. It lets them speak to each other. It lets them collapse into one as the loop closes, and the only consequence is a faint emotional bruise. That is the first thing Gravity Falls teaches you about its own time travel, that the timeline is elastic, that the universe will tolerate brief duplicates of you, and that the cost of a paradox is almost always a feeling rather than an erasure. It will get harder than that very quickly, but it starts here, with a boy trying to ask a girl to dance and failing in 9 different ways. The second paradox runs underneath the first, because while Dipper is using the time machine to chase a moment, Mabel is using it to chase a pig. The pig is called Waddles, and she meets him at the fairground, and the version of the past that contains Waddles is also the version of the past where Dipper loses Wendy. The show does something quietly devastating with this. It tells you, in the gentlest possible way, that there is no version of the day where both children get exactly what they want, that the timeline is a zero-sum game even when the wishes are small and personal, and that to undo one moment is to undo all the moments downstream of it. Mabel chooses the pig, Dipper accepts the loss, and the paradox the show is interested in is not the technical one, it is the moral one. If you could go back and fix the worst thing that happened to you today, and the cost was someone you loved losing the best thing that happened to them, would you do it? The show is asking that question of a 12-year-old, and a 12-year-old is answering honestly, which is part of why this episode lingers in people's memory the way it does. The paradox is not in the machine. The paradox is in the choice. The third paradox is the one the show buries inside the same episode and never directly addresses, which is the question of how Blendin Blandin got his time machine in the first place. He is, by his own admission, a janitor. He is not a scientist. He is not an architect of temporal mechanics. He is the equivalent of a maintenance worker who has been handed a key to a building that no one else is allowed to enter. The device on his wrist is referred to in the show as a tape measure because that is what it looks like, a small gray rectangle with a pull cord, and the existence of that device implies an entire civilization in the future capable of casual, handheld temporal manipulation. The paradox is that none of that civilization is ever visible on screen in the present day. The future has reached back into Gravity Falls. It has employed a man to clean up after itself, and yet the past has no idea any of this is happening. The show treats this as background comedy, but it is, if you sit with it, one of the most unsettling implications in the series. Every odd moment in the town, every glitch, Everything that does not quite add up could in principle be Blendin or one of his colleagues, quietly mopping up after something the future does not want you to see. You are being watched, in this reading, by a janitor, and the janitor is bored, and the bucket he is carrying is the bucket of your own history. The fourth paradox has a name, and it is named in the 8th episode of the 2nd season, an episode called Blendin's Game, in which the same bald janitor returns, this time for revenge. He blames Dipper and Mabel for ruining his life, for getting him exiled from his future home, and he challenges them to a game called Globnar, a gladiatorial contest in a distant future arena overseen by the enormous infant deity called the Time Baby. The paradox inside Blendin's Game is one of the cleanest grandfather paradoxes you will see in a children's cartoon. The twins win Globnar. The prize is a single wish that can be granted across all of time, and what Dipper wants to use it for is to go back and visit Soos as a child, on the worst birthday Soos ever had, the birthday his father failed to show up for. Soos's father had promised he would be there. The boy had waited, and the boy had built his whole adult sweetness on top of that broken promise. And Dipper's first instinct, with a wish that could rewrite anything, is to fix that day. He cannot. The temporal mechanics of the episode will not let him stop the father from leaving, and the wish, when it is finally spent, is spent on something small and kind. The paradox is in what does not happen. Soos is not allowed to have a different father, because the version of Soos who became their friend is the version who was shaped by that absence, and the show is honest enough to tell you, without underlining it, that some sadnesses are load-bearing. The 5th paradox is the appearance of the older Soos. During Globnar, in one of the most beloved scenes in the entire series, a future version of Soos appears as a contestant, an older, bearded, mellow Soos who has clearly lived a long life, and who tells the twins that he is fighting for the prize of a sandwich he once had as a child and could never find again. The paradox is that this older Soos cannot exist in the way the show is asking you to believe in him, because the present-day Soos, by most accounts in the wider lore, is in his early 20s, and the older Soos is described as being significantly older, and they are both alive in the same arena at the same time. Either Globnar pulls fighters from across all of time and stacks them in the same physical space, in which case the arena is itself a kind of pocket dimension where causality does not apply, or the older Soos is from a future that has already happened, in which case any change the twins make to his past should ripple through to him, and yet he is allowed to stand there, fully himself, on a future that has not yet been decided. The show does not explain this. The show simply lets older Soos hand his younger self a piece of advice, lets him smile, and lets him fade out of the story, and the warmth of the scene papers over the impossibility of it. That is a recurring trick in Gravity Falls. The emotional truth is so strong that you forget to ask whether the physics holds. The 6th paradox is the one that haunts the rest of the series after Blendin's Game ends. The twins have been to the future. They have seen, even briefly, the world of the Time Baby, the architecture of a civilization that has mastered time, and they bring nothing back with them except a small souvenir and a story no one in the present day will believe. The paradox here is one of memory and meaning. They know things now that they cannot use. They have stood in a future where their own childhoods are ancient history, and they walk back into Grunkle Stan's living room and eat cereal as if nothing has changed. The show is interested, very quietly, in what it does to a child to know that adulthood is real, that everyone they love will get old, that the summer they are inside is already history from a certain angle. And Blendin's Game is the episode where Dipper, especially, begins to understand that he is a person inside time and not outside it. The paradox is that this knowledge is too big for him to hold and too small to change anything, and he holds it anyway, and the rest of the season is, in part, the story of him learning to put it down. The 7th paradox is structural, and it belongs to the very last act of the series, in the first part of the Weirdmageddon trilogy. The Time Baby is established across the series as a near-omnipotent figure, the law and the engine of the timeline, and the show has spent 2 seasons telling you that this is the most dangerous and most powerful entity in the temporal stack. And then, in a single line, almost as a throwaway, the Time Baby is killed. Bill Cipher snaps his fingers, the Time Baby is destroyed, and with him, presumably, goes the entire temporal authority that Blendin works for. The paradox is what this should mean for the rest of the show. If the regulator of the timeline is gone, then any change anyone has ever made, any loop, any duplicate, any visit from the future, should in principle become unstable. The fact that the timeline does not visibly collapse implies one of two things. Either the Time Baby was never as central as the show implied, in which case the Globnar arena was theater, or the timeline has a deeper stabilizer that the show is choosing not to reveal. The Book of Bill, the companion text published years later, plays in this space. But inside the show itself, the death of the Time Baby is one of the quietest catastrophes in the series. And the paradox of it is that nobody, including the writers, ever quite addresses what it means for everything else that has come before. The eighth paradox lives inside Bill Cipher's introduction, and it is the paradox of an entity whose existence the show flatly refuses to fit inside its own physics. Bill appears for the first time in the 19th episode of the first season, an episode called Dreamscaperers. And the conceit of the episode is that Dipper and Mabel and Soos enter Grunkle Stan's dreaming mind in order to protect a secret combination from being read by an invader. The invader is Bill, and the way the show introduces him is not as a creature inside a dream, but as a creature who is the dream. A flat yellow triangle with a single eye, who can pause time inside the dream space, who can rearrange the laws of the dream at will, and who knows things he should have no way of knowing. The paradox is what Bill is, ontologically. He claims later in the series to be a being from a higher dimension, a creature without a body, who exists outside three-dimensional space and outside linear time. If that is true, then his presence inside Stan's mind is not an intrusion at all. It is a projection, because a higher dimensional being cannot really fit inside a three-dimensional dream, any more than a sphere can really fit inside a sheet of paper. The Bill you see in the dream is a shadow of a Bill, and yet the show keeps treating him as if the shadow is the whole creature. The paradox is the slip between those two things. You are looking at a being that, by his own description, you cannot really see, and the show is asking you to believe that the thing in the dream is the thing itself, which it cannot be. The ninth paradox is about Bill's knowledge. From the moment he appears, Bill knows things about the family that no one in Gravity Falls has told him. He knows about the author. He knows about the journals. He knows about the portal in the basement. He knows the secrets that Stan has spent 30 years trying to bury, and he speaks of them in a tone that suggests he has been watching this town and this family for a very long time. The paradox is that nothing on screen ever explains how Bill came to know any of it. He says, with characteristic vagueness, that he sees things, that he has been waiting, that he has been patient, and the show is content to let that stand. But if Bill is genuinely outside time in the way he claims, then there is a deeper paradox lurking under his omniscience, which is that he should already know how the story ends, including his own defeat, and yet he is acting as if the outcome is in doubt. Either his foresight is selective, in which case he is less than he claims, or it is total, in which case the entirety of his villainy is performance, and he is playing a role he already knows the ending of. The show flirts with both readings without ever committing to one, and that is part of why he is such an effective antagonist, because the audience cannot quite work out which paradox he is occupying. The 10th paradox is the deal mechanic. Bill, throughout the series, makes deals. He shakes hands with people, his hand bursts into blue flame, and the terms of the deal become binding in a way that the show treats as nearly inviolable. The paradox here is that a deal is a contract between two parties, and a contract requires a shared framework of meaning, and Bill, by his own description, does not share a framework of meaning with anything in the human world. He is a creature without a body who has lived for an unimaginable length of time, and yet he is bound by a handshake. The show implies that the binding force of the handshake is something deeper than either party, that there is a layer of cosmic law underneath even Bill, that contracts and promises have a kind of teeth that he cannot dodge. If that is true, then Bill is not the most powerful thing in the show, the deal mechanic is. And Bill is just a creature who has worked out how to weaponize it. The paradox of this reading is that the show never shows you what is enforcing the deals. There is no court, no judge, no warden. The deals simply hold, the way gravity holds, and the inside of a Gravity Falls handshake turns out to be one of the most quietly powerful objects in the entire universe of the show. The 11th paradox is the eye. Across the series, in the journals, on the tapestries of an ancient civilization, in the credits, the symbol of a single open eye inside a triangle appears again and again, and it appears in places that predate Bill's stated arrival in the human world by, in some cases, thousands of years. The show implies in a second season episode set in the past that an entire pre-Columbian society in the region of what would become Gravity Falls had worshipped Bill, that they had built a temple to him, that they had carved his shape into their walls and floors. The paradox is the chicken and the egg of it. Did Bill exist because the symbol was drawn, or was the symbol drawn because Bill existed? The show, late in its run, gives you the answer that Bill is real, and the symbol is the record of his real presence. But it never quite addresses the deeper question, which is why a creature outside time would care about being depicted at any particular moment of human history. The most generous reading is that Bill is a kind of attractor, that anywhere humans look long enough at the idea of a single observing eye, they end up drawing him, and that he is in some sense the inevitable shape of the suspicion that you are being watched. That is a reading the show is comfortable with. The paradox is that it makes Bill less of a character and more of an emergent property of consciousness, and the show wants him to be both, which is harder than it looks. The 12th paradox is the author. Stanford Pines, the man who wrote the 3 journals at the center of the mystery, is introduced through his absence. The journals exist before he does, in narrative terms, because Dipper finds one in the woods in the first episode and uses it for 30 episodes before the author of the journals appears in person. The paradox here is mundane and elegant at once. Every observation in the journals is, by definition, a description of something the author has seen, and yet the journals also contain warnings about creatures the author cannot have survived a direct encounter with. He describes the things in the woods, in the lake, in the caves, with a level of intimacy that suggests he has been hurt by them, and a level of survival that suggests he has not been hurt enough. The paradox is the impossible competence of the author, the fact that he has apparently met every monster in the region and lived to take notes. And the deeper paradox is that the journals are also, in some places, written in the voice of a man who is losing his mind. He warns himself in the margins. He writes, "Trust no one," in shaking handwriting. He hides pages, he tears pages out, and you are reading the document of a man who is simultaneously the most informed and the least reliable narrator in the show. The 13th paradox is the basement. Underneath the mystery shack, sealed behind a vending machine, is a chamber that contains a portal, and the portal has been built by Stanford Pines, by most accounts in the early 1980s, with the help of Bill Cipher, although Stanford does not know that at the time. The paradox of the portal is the paradox of the foundational object in any time travel or interdimensional story, which is that you cannot tell, from the inside, whether the object was built or whether it always existed. The blueprint for the portal comes, indirectly, from Bill. Bill plants the idea in Stanford's mind, Bill provides the technical guidance in dreams, and Bill, in this way, causes the portal to come into existence. But the portal is also the door through which Bill plans to enter our dimension, which means Bill is the cause of the means of his own arrival. He has reached backwards through Stanford to write himself a doorway, and the closed loop of that act is one of the cleanest causal paradoxes in the series. There is no outside to it. The portal exists because Bill needed it to exist, and Bill could only act in our dimension because the portal allowed it, and the show is content to let this loop sit at the center of its mythology without ever forcing a resolution. The 14th paradox is the brother who is and is not. The 12th episode of the second season, A Tale of Two Stans, is where the show finally explains the entire backstory of the Pines family, and the central revelation is that the man you have been calling Grunkle Stan for 30 episodes is not Stanford. He is Stanley, the twin brother who has been impersonating his missing sibling for 30 years, running the mystery shack under his brother's name, signing his brother's name, collecting his brother's mail, drawing his brother's social security, all while trying to bring his brother back from the dimension on the other side of the portal. The paradox here is identity at its most legal and most personal. Stanley has been Stanford in every administrative sense for 3 decades, which is longer than many marriages and longer than most working lives, and yet Stanley has never been Stanford in any inner sense. He has carried the name without carrying the person. The show asks, very gently, what it means to inhabit someone else's identity for that long, and whether the person you become at the end of it is still really you. Stanley's answer is yes, but a tired, complicated yes. And the paradox is that he has saved his brother's life by being his brother for 30 years and has lost his own life in the process. The 15th paradox is the legal death of Stanford. Inside the world of the show, Stanford Pines is officially dead. He has been declared dead in the early 1980s, after he disappeared, and Stanley has been living on the property and operating the business under Stanford's identity. When Stanford finally returns through the portal, the paradox the show only briefly nods at is that the man standing in the kitchen is, on paper, a corpse. He has no legal existence. He cannot vote, cannot hold a bank account in his own name, cannot show identification, because the United States government, for many years, has been treating him as deceased. The show treats this as a domestic joke, but the implication is heavier than the joke. Stanford has lost not just 3 decades of life, but the entire administrative scaffolding of a person, and to come back to a country that does not believe in him is its own kind of paradox. He is alive and not alive, present and not present, and his brother has been the proof of him for so long that his return almost has to start with a quiet negotiation about which of them is going to keep using the name. The 16th paradox is the journals themselves. There are 3 of them. Each was written by Stanford. Each was hidden in a different location in the Gravity Falls region, in such a way that they could be found by the right person, and the right person turned out to be a 12-year-old boy named Dipper. The paradox is the design of the hiding. If Stanford genuinely wanted the journals to be lost, he could have destroyed them, and he chose not to. If he genuinely wanted them to be found, he could have left them somewhere obvious, and he chose not to. The hiding is, in a sense, optimized for the exact kind of seeker who would find them. A curious, anxious, slightly lonely child with a notebook of his own, and Dipper fits that description perfectly. The show implies, without ever saying it directly, that Stanford was writing for a future reader he could not see, that he was leaving breadcrumbs into the dark, hoping that someone would care enough to follow them. The paradox is that the breadcrumbs worked, that Dipper found them, and that the entire plot of the series is, in this sense, the closing of a 30-year loop in which a lonely scientist writes letters to a boy he has never met, and the boy writes back by being there when the scientist returns. The 17th paradox is the 3rd journal, the one Dipper finds in the woods in the very first episode. Of all 3, the 3rd is the one with the largest fingerprint of Bill on it, because by the time Stanford was writing the 3rd journal, he had already realized, too late, that the entity he had trusted as a muse was not a muse at all. The 3rd journal therefore contains both the most useful information about the supernatural and the most desperate warnings about Bill, and the paradox is that those warnings are addressed to a future self, to a Stanford who would, in theory, read them again on his return. They are not, on the page, addressed to Dipper. They are diary entries, internal arguments, warnings from a man to himself, and yet they are read by a child, and that child uses them to survive a summer the author never intended a child to live through. The paradox is the wrong reader, the right book. Every page of advice for an experienced scientist becomes, in Dipper's hands, a survival manual for a kid who is in over his head, and the journal works for that purpose, even though it was never written for it. There is a quiet idea in here about what happens to the things we write, once we let them go into the world, and how often they end up saving the people they were never meant to reach. The 18th paradox is the burning of the journals. At the climax of the series, in the closing part of the Weirdmageddon trilogy, Bill captures the family, and the deal he offers Stanford is freedom, in exchange for the equation that will let Bill expand his reign of weirdness from the town of Gravity Falls across the entire world. Stanford refuses, but Bill captures the journals, and at the end of the conflict, the journals are destroyed, burned, gone. The paradox is the survival of the information regardless. By the time the journals are gone, Dipper has internalized so much of them that the loss of the object does not erase the knowledge. The journals were always, in some sense, a delivery mechanism, and the delivery has occurred. The paradox is the question of whether the journals matter once they have been read, and the show's quiet answer is that they do not. The thing that mattered was the act of reading. The pages are ash, the warnings live in a boy's head, and the curve of that transfer is the moment at which the long arc of the author's loneliness finally lands somewhere safe. The paradox is that you cannot grieve a journal that has done its job. You can only thank it. The 19th paradox is small and almost comic, and it lives inside the very first episodes. The Mystery Shack, the rundown tourist trap that Stanley operates under his brother's name, contains a collection of supposedly supernatural exhibits, all of which are presented as fake, as cheap stuffed animals stitched together with extra limbs and labeled with comically improbable names. The paradox is that the town outside the shack is, in fact, full of real supernatural creatures, and Stanley, the man running the shack, knows that the real ones exist because he is in the middle of a 30-year project to retrieve his brother from another dimension. He is selling fakes of monsters that he has good reason to believe are real, and the paradox is the strange double bluff this represents. The real monsters of Gravity Falls are protected, in a sense, by the fact that Stanley has flooded the market with absurd fakes. Anyone who came to the town looking for the genuine article would be confronted, first, by Stanley's gleefully tacky parody, and they would presumably conclude that there was nothing here worth investigating. The con is also a camouflage. Stanley, without ever quite intending it, has spent 30 years making the entire mystery of Gravity Falls look unserious enough to be ignored, and that is part of why the town has survived as long as it has. The 20th paradox lives inside the gnomes. The gnomes appear in the very first episode of the series, and are one of the first supernatural creatures the show introduces to you. And they are, on the surface, ridiculous. They are small, bearded, red-hatted men who throw up rainbows when they are struck or defeated, and who can stack themselves on top of one another to form a single, lurching, hollow giant. The paradox of the gnome giant is one of the rare physics paradoxes in the show that the show seems aware of and does not bother to defend. A giant made of small bodies should not be able to think with a single mind. There is no top-level brain, no shared nervous system, no organizing will, and yet the show shows you the giant talking, making decisions, pursuing Mabel through the forest as a coherent unit. The implication is that the gnomes share consciousness in a way that does not depend on a single physical brain, that there is a collective mind that emerges when enough of them are in contact. That implication is never followed up. The gnomes never appear in the show as anything more than a comic recurring threat, and yet the very first creature the series shows you is, if you look at it too hard, the most metaphysically strange. You are being told, in the first half hour, that minds in Gravity Falls do not necessarily live inside single bodies. The rest of the series quietly relies on you having accepted that without noticing. The 21st paradox is the wax figures. In the third episode of the first season, an episode called Headhunters, Stanley owns a small museum of wax figures, and one night, after closing, the figures come alive and begin to move. They are revealed to be sentient creatures animated by some unspecified curse, and they eventually attack the family before being melted in the dawn light. The paradox is that none of this is ever explained, and the show never returns to it. There is a baseline level of magical animation operating inside the Mystery Shack that should, by rights, undermine the entire premise of the museum. If wax can come alive, then any number of the supposedly fake exhibits in the rest of the shack are also at risk of being something other than fake. The fact that they are not, that no other exhibit ever displays a hint of life, is itself a strange detail. Either the wax figures were a unique case, in which case there is a curse operating somewhere in the building that is bound only to them, or magic in the shack is selective and weather-dependent, in a way the show never bothers to systematize. The paradox is the cheerful inconsistency of magical rules in Gravity Falls. The series treats every supernatural event as a one-off, and yet by the end of 2 seasons it has accumulated a list of phenomena that, taken together, imply a world in which almost any object could in principle be alive. And you accept this without it ever becoming overwhelming, because the show is too charming to let you stop and add it up. The 22nd paradox is the manliness tester. In an early episode of the first season, an episode called Dipper versus Manliness, Dipper, frustrated at being teased for being unmanly, climbs a mountain to find a beast known as the multi-bear, and along the way the show introduces a contraption called the manliness tester, a machine at the local diner that purports to measure how manly a person is by some unstated metric. The paradox is in the calibration. The machine is operated by ordinary townsfolk for ordinary jokes, and yet it appears to be able to make a verdict, that is, to claim a real quantitative reading of an abstract human quality in a way that the rest of the show would normally treat as supernatural. The show is offering you, without comment, a device that purports to read the soul and is using it as a punchline. The paradox is the casualness of this. In any other show, a soul-reading device would be the central artifact of an entire episode. In Gravity Falls, it is a one-shot prop in the corner of a diner, and the show moves past it as if it did not just briefly imply that the metaphysics of masculinity is something that can be measured in pounds. The 23rd paradox is the clone copier. The 7th episode of the first season, an episode called Double Dipper, contains a Xerox machine in the basement of an event venue that, when used to photocopy a part of a person, generates a fully sentient clone of that person. Dipper uses it to copy himself, then to copy his copies, then to copy his copies of his copies, until there are dozens of Dippers running around the building. The paradox is multiplicative. Each clone is, by the show's own logic, a full dipper, with his memories up to the moment of copying and his own ongoing experience after. Each clone is a person, in any meaningful sense. By the end of the night, all of them are destroyed by water, dissolved back into pulp, and the original dipper goes home, as if a moral catastrophe has not just occurred. The paradox the show is asking you to ignore is whether the original dipper has just been responsible for the mass death of a small group of conscious beings who were, in every way that matters, him. The show does not let Dipper sit with this question, and the cheerfulness of the episode is, in retrospect, one of the most unsettling things in the early run. The horror is not in the screen. The horror is in the implication, and the show is content to leave it there. The 24th paradox is Lil Gideon. Gideon Gleeful is a small blonde child psychic who runs a tent ministry in the center of town, charging admission for fake fortune-telling, and yet, beneath the act, he has access to the second of Stanford's journals and to a small green amulet that gives him real psychic power. The paradox of Gideon is the gap between his apparent gift and his actual fraud. He is a fake psychic who is also, in some narrow sense, a real one. The amulet gives him telekinesis, and a fragment of Bill's attention gives him guidance. And yet the readings he sells to the people of Gravity Falls are scripted in advance, based on private information his father has gathered for him. He is a real magician hiding behind a fake one, and the paradox is the choice of disguise. Why would a child with genuine psychic ability bother to fake the ability he already has? The implication is that Gideon does not trust his real gift, that the showmanship is the part he understands, that the supernatural is something he has been handed and resents and uses badly. The fake psychic act is, in this reading, the only part of Gideon that feels honest, because it is the part he built himself, and the paradox is that the most authentic thing about him is his fraud. The 25th paradox is the shapeshifter. In the second episode of the second season, an episode called Into the Bunker, Dipper and Wendy and Soos discover an underground bunker built by Stanford during his years of investigation, and at the bottom of the bunker is a creature, a shapeshifter, that can take the form of any living thing it has seen. The paradox lives in a single moment near the end of the episode. The creature, before being frozen in cryogenic sleep, takes on what it claims is the form it would have taken in the future, and the form is a strange, twisted, surreal silhouette that the show holds on the screen just long enough for you to absorb it. The paradox is that the shapeshifter could not have seen the future. The whole rules of its ability, as the show has established them, depend on past observation. To take on a future form, the creature must either be lying, in which case the threat is theater, or it must have access to information no creature in the show should have, in which case the rules of shapeshifting are not what the show told you they were. Fans have spent years trying to decode that final form, debating whether it predicts a creature later in the series, whether it is a hint at the larger mythology of the show, whether it is just a designer's flourish. The show has never confirmed any of those readings, and the paradox is that the moment carries weight precisely because it cannot quite be explained. The 26th paradox is the bottomless pit. In one of the segmented episodes of the first season, the family stands at the edge of a hole in the ground that is, by the title and by every character's description, bottomless. They fall in, they tell each other stories on the way down, and at the end of the short they land. The paradox is the contradiction baked into the premise. A bottomless pit, by definition, has no bottom, and yet the show shows them hitting the ground at the end. Either the pit is not bottomless, in which case the title is a lie, or the pit had no bottom and acquired one in the moment they needed it to, which is a different and stranger kind of physics. The simplest reading is that the pit is bottomless in a loose, narrative sense, and the show is comfortable cheating its own definitions for the sake of a joke. The slightly more interesting reading is that the pit is, in fact, a kind of pocket space, that things falling into it experience an indeterminate amount of time and an indeterminate amount of fall, and that what they think of as the bottom is wherever the pit decides they have suffered enough. There is no reason to read the pit this carefully. The show is not asking you to. But it is one of those small objects in Gravity Falls that, if you stare at it long enough, opens up into something genuinely strange. The 27th paradox sits inside the same patchwork episode, in a scene where Stanley demonstrates a pinball machine that, when activated, swallows objects fed into it and produces, eventually, a perfect pizza. The pizza is shown to be real. The act of producing it is shown to be reproducible. The implication is that, sitting in the back of the Mystery Shack, there is a machine that converts mass into prepared food. The paradox is the casualness of the invention. Any culture that possessed a working matter assembler capable of producing food on demand from arbitrary input would be transformed by it. And yet Stanley uses it as a novelty, as a way to entertain his great niece and nephew, and the machine does not appear again. The simplest reading is that the entire bit is a gag, that the show is winking at the absurdity of the Mystery Shack, that no reasonable person should attempt to take it seriously. The slightly more curious reading is that the Mystery Shack, sitting on top of supernatural Earth, is itself a kind of slow magical accumulator, that things built inside it pick up properties from the ground underneath, and that the pizza machine is not Stanley's invention, but an accident of geography. The show, characteristically, declines to commit to either reading. The 28th paradox is Old Man McGucket. He is introduced in the very first episode of the show as a babbling, deranged townsperson, the kind of figure every small-town comedy uses for cheap, eccentric color, and he remains that figure for most of the first season. The paradox is the slow, devastating revelation that he is not, and never was, a fool. He was once Fiddleford McGucket, a brilliant engineer and the closest collaborator Stanford had during the construction of the portal, and the reason he is now wandering the town in his nightshirt babbling about robots is that he has erased his own memories, repeatedly, using a device of his own invention called the memory gun. He could not bear the things he had seen, the visions Bill had let him glimpse, the role he had played in opening the portal, and he chose to forget, and the choosing has destroyed him. The paradox is the conservation of self. Every time McGucket uses the memory gun on himself, he removes a piece of the person he is, and the question the show is asking, very quietly, is whether the man at the end of a long enough chain of erasures is still in any meaningful sense the same man who started erasing. By the time the family meets him in the present day, he has lost so much of himself that he cannot reliably remember the names of his old friends, and yet, when his memories are restored to him in the second season, he is recognizably the man he used to be. The paradox is the persistence of a person even through the deliberate destruction of his own memory. The self, in Gravity Falls, turns out to be something that can be hidden but not extinguished, and the implication of that is more comforting and more terrifying than the show ever quite says. The 29th paradox is the memory gun itself. The device, as the show presents it, can target a specific memory or set of memories and remove them entirely. It is used by McGucket on himself, it is used by the secretive Blind Eye Society on the townspeople of Gravity Falls, and it is used, at the end of the series, on Bill Cipher's last hiding place inside Stanley's mind. The paradox is that the memory gun appears to violate the conservation of information in a way that the rest of the show is largely careful about. A memory removed by the gun is gone. There is no copy. There is no archive. And yet the people from whom memories have been removed continue to function, to recognize things, to feel things, to remember the world in a way that is consistent with everything except the removed item. That is much more sophisticated, mechanically, than the show ever pauses to acknowledge. Memory is not stored in a single place. To remove a memory cleanly while leaving every other associated memory intact would require a level of precision that implies the gun is doing something other than what it appears to be doing. The implication is that the gun is editing the structure of the brain in a way that retrofits a believable past. You do not just forget what you saw. You are given a new memory to fill the hole. The paradox is that the people walking around Gravity Falls with redacted memories are not less people for it. They are walking around inside slightly different versions of themselves, and they have no way to know. The 30th paradox is the Blind Eye Society. They are introduced in a late first season episode and elaborated in the second season, and they are a secret organization in the town dedicated to using the memory gun on anyone in Gravity Falls who has had a supernatural encounter, in order to keep the secret of the town from leaking out into the wider world. The paradox of the Blind Eye Society is one of the most unsettling in the series. Their work is, on its face, a kind of protective service. They are erasing trauma from people who would otherwise be tormented by what they have seen. But their work is also, in a deeper sense, the systematic theft of every townsperson's right to know what is happening to them. Each erasure is a small abduction of self, and the cumulative effect on the town is that it is populated by people whose lives are full of gaps they cannot perceive. The paradox is that they cannot tell. The Blind Eye Society has done its job too well. There is no whistleblower because there is no whistle to blow. The members of the society are themselves not always free of the gun, and the chain of responsibility within the organization is constantly being erased by the device that holds the organization together. They are a community of people who have agreed to forget what they have done to one another, which is one of the most chilling concepts the show ever puts on screen without underlining it. The 31st paradox is the society's own foundation. McGucket built the gun, and McGucket helped to found the society, and McGucket then erased his own membership in the society from his own mind. The paradox is whether McGucket, in his current state, is still in some sense a member, or whether the act of forgetting his own affiliation has, in his case, severed it. The show does not provide an answer. McGucket does not appear, in the present day, to be operating as a member of the society. He acts, when he encounters supernatural events, as if he is encountering them for the first time. And yet the founding documents of the society, if such things existed, would presumably bear his name. The paradox is the question of who you are when the records of who you were are accurate and your own internal sense of yourself is not. The society's gun, used on its inventor, has produced a man who is simultaneously the architect of the institution and a stranger to it, and that is, in some ways, the perfect description of what the gun does. It uncouples a person from his own past while leaving the past unchanged. The 32nd paradox is the deal Stanley does not know he made. Across the run of the series, Bill Cipher makes a number of deals, and one of the smaller and stranger ones takes place not in dialogue, but in implication. Bill, throughout the show, is described as choosing a vessel, a human body he can briefly possess in order to act in the physical world, and the rules of the possession appear to require some kind of consent. The paradox is that consent in the Gravity Falls model is alarmingly easy to give. A handshake will do it. A throwaway sentence will do it. A poorly chosen phrase, said in jest, will do it. Has at some point done or said something that could in principle be construed as agreement, and that Bill is enormously sensitive to the precise framing of these moments. The paradox is the legal weight given to the offhand. The thing you said in passing, in another life, in a tone you cannot now remember, may be the thing that allows the demon of the dream world to ride you. That is a terrifying idea to find in a children's cartoon, and the show, characteristically, smuggles it past you wrapped in jokes. The 33rd paradox is the Stanchurian candidate. There is an episode in the second season, an episode of the same name, in which Stanley runs for mayor of Gravity Falls, and during the course of the campaign, Mabel discovers a set of magical neckties that allow the wearer to control the wearer's movements and speech. Mabel uses the necktie on Stanley, ostensibly to make him a better candidate, and the paradox of the episode is the question of agency. Stanley, while under the necktie, says and does things that are not really his, and yet the things he says and does, if they win him the election, will have him as their named author. He will be the mayor. His name will be on the office. The paradox is whether a person who has been remote-controlled into office can be said to have won it. The episode treats this lightly, but the implication is heavy. The necktie is just one of many devices in the show that operate on the surface of a person without touching the inside, and Gravity Falls is full of these objects, full of small artifacts that let one person move through another. The paradox is whether the inside of a person is private at all, in a town where so many objects can briefly override it. The 34th paradox is the sock opera possession. In the 4th episode of the second season, an episode called Sock Opera, Bill possesses Dipper directly, taking control of his body in exchange for a promise to help Bill find a code to a laptop containing crucial information. The paradox is the physical interaction of the possession. Bill, who has been previously described as an entity that exists outside three-dimensional space, is now inhabiting a three-dimensional body, walking, talking, breaking things, attempting to harm the body he is in. He cannot feel pain in the same way Dipper does, and he abuses the body, slamming it into hard objects, throwing it downstairs, trying to break its fingers. The paradox is the willingness of Bill to do this to a body he is occupying. There is no obvious reason for him to harm the body except to make Dipper, watching from the dream space, suffer. The implication is that Bill experiences cruelty as a pleasure that requires a witness, and that the witness is Dipper, and that the entire performance is a small private show. Inside the comedy of the episode is one of the darker little portraits the series makes of its villain, a creature for whom the body is a costume, and the wearing of it is itself the joke. The flashbacks in A Tale of Two Stans show Bill first appearing to Stanford in a dream during the construction of the portal, and from Stanford's point of view, this is their first meeting. The paradox is what the show implies about Bill's history with the town long before the dream. The murals in the cave, the symbols carved into stone, the worship of an earlier civilization, all suggest that Bill has been entering the dreams of people in this place for a very long time. There must have been, before Stanford, hundreds of dreamers, perhaps thousands, whom Bill courted and abandoned. Stanford is not the first man with a notebook to be visited. He is just the first man with a notebook to leave a useful enough record that the family in the present day can find him. And the show only gestures at this. Stanford is the first one who came close, and the paradox is that, by coming close, he made it possible for his nephew to be the one who finally closed the door. The 36th paradox is Weirdmageddon itself. In the closing arc of the second season, Bill succeeds in opening a small, permanent rift between his dimension and ours, and the area around Gravity Falls becomes a zone in which the laws of physics no longer reliably apply. The sky turns a shifting yellow, geometry breaks, the dead and the strange spill out of crevices in the air. The paradox at the heart of Weirdmageddon is the local nature of it. The catastrophe, while devastating to the town, does not appear to spread beyond a containment ring around the Gravity Falls area, and the rest of the world is described as continuing on unaware. The implication is that Bill's entry into our dimension is bound, by some force the show does not name, to a specific region. He cannot, despite his apparent godlike power, get past the town's perimeter without something else giving way, and the equation he is trying to extract from Stanford is the equation that would let him cross that boundary. The paradox is that the most dangerous creature in the cosmology of the show is, in a sense, trapped, that he has won locally and lost globally, and that the climactic final battle is, in geographic terms, a small fight on a small piece of land at the edge of a forest. The world goes on, the town suffers. The paradox is that almost nobody in the larger world has any idea what is happening, and the show treats this as both the tragedy and the consolation of the story. The 37th paradox is Mabel's bubble. During Weirdmageddon, Bill traps Mabel inside a small reality bubble, a pocket dimension designed by him as a kind of perfect summer that never ends. The bubble grants Mabel her every wish in cartoon form. There are infinite versions of her favorite foods, an army of friends shaped to her preferences, a sky that never darkens, a calendar that never moves. The paradox at the center of the bubble is the central paradox of the entire series in miniature. Mabel, throughout the show, has been struggling with the knowledge that the summer is going to end, that she and her brother are about to enter their teenage years, that Dipper is becoming someone she will not always be able to reach, that her childhood is, in the most literal sense, expiring. The bubble offers her the answer to that fear, which is a place where the expiry does not happen, and the paradox is that the answer is worse than the fear. To live forever in the summer that has already ended is to live nowhere at all. The bubble is paradise and prison in the same shape, and Mabel's decision, in the end, to leave it, is one of the most quietly grown-up moments in the show. She chooses time. She chooses the version of her life where things end. That is, in a strange way, the moral spine of the entire series, and it is contained in the choice to step out of a bubble that contained everything but reality. The 38th paradox is Dippy Fresh. Inside Mabel's bubble, alongside the infinite confections and the impossible weather, is a small replacement Dipper, a version of her brother who has been redesigned by the bubble's logic to be exactly the friend she has been pretending Dipper is. He is called Dippy Fresh. He is cheerful, accommodating, free of the anxiety that the real Dipper has been carrying, eager to do exactly what Mabel wants. The paradox of Dippy Fresh is that he is, on the bubble's terms, a perfect brother, and yet his perfection is what makes it impossible to mistake him for the real thing. The real Dipper is sharp and worried and full of small refusals. Dippy Fresh is none of those things, and the difference between them is, in the end, what tells Mabel that she has been lied to. The paradox is the impossibility of designing a real person from the outside. Even Bill, who can build a bubble that contains anything you have ever wanted, cannot quite build a person who is loved. Dippy Fresh is missing something specific, and the show is asking, very quietly, what that something is. The answer it offers is friction. The thing that makes Dipper Dipper is the part of him that resists you, and you cannot love someone who has had that part removed. The 39th paradox is the throne. During Weirdmageddon, Bill builds a throne for himself out of the bodies of his captured enemies, frozen in place and made into furniture. The friends and family of the Pines twins are turned into gold or stone or other inert substances, and Bill sits on top of them while he plans the next phase of his rule. The paradox of the throne is the question of whether the people in it are still alive. The show presents them as preserved rather than killed, in the sense that they are restored when Bill is defeated, but during the period in which they are part of the throne, they have no obvious agency, no obvious experience, no obvious passage of time. They are, in effect, suspended. The paradox is the moral status of that suspension. Bill is, in this period, surrounded by his enemies in the most literal possible way, sitting on top of them, and yet none of them are doing anything to him. They are, by any external measure, his audience. The implication is that the worst thing Bill does to people is not destroy them, but make them into spectators of his triumph, and the throne is the perfect crystallization of that. The paradox is the cruelty of an audience you cannot leave. The 40th paradox is the wheel. In the second season, Stanford reveals to Dipper the existence of a prophecy in the form of a wheel of symbols, each symbol representing a member of a small group of people in Gravity Falls who, together, might be capable of defeating Bill. The wheel is, on the surface, a tidy bit of mythology, a 10-symbol arrangement that promises a final showdown. The paradox is what happens when the prophecy fails. In the show's actual climax, the 10 people associated with the symbols come together, briefly, in a circle, and the spell collapses because of a misunderstanding between Stanford and Stanley at the worst possible moment. The wheel does not work. The plan does not work, and the show turns away from the wheel almost entirely, finding its real ending in something much smaller, in a single act of brotherly sacrifice that has nothing to do with prophecy. The paradox is what this implies about the value of a prophecy in this universe. Either the wheel was real, and the moment of its failure was the moment Bill should have won, or the wheel was a misdirection, a decoy, and the actual mechanism of his defeat was always going to be something simpler and more personal. The show seems to want both readings. The wheel matters and the wheel does not matter, and the paradox is the place where those two things meet. The 41st paradox is the trick that defeats Bill. The way Bill is actually beaten in the final episode is, on the surface, an act of trust and an act of trickery in the same gesture. Stanley agrees to let Bill enter his mind, knowing that Stanford is going to use the memory gun while Bill is inside it, erasing the demon along with the memories that hold him. The paradox is the cost. Stanley walks out of the encounter alive, but he walks out without his memories of who he is, of his brother, of his family, of the children who have been living with him for the summer. The defeat of Bill requires the temporary erasure of Stanley. He gives up his self in order to take Bill's self with him, and for a long moment, in the closing minutes of the series, he is a man without a past, looking at his great-niece and nephew without recognizing them. The paradox is the question of whether his memories, when they return, are really his. They come back to him because the children sit with him and remind him of the things he has loved, and the implication is that the self can be reassembled from the outside, that the people who know you can pour you back into your own skin. That is one of the most generous ideas in the show, and it is also one of the strangest, because it implies that you are not, in any final sense, a private object. You are the sum of the people who hold you in their heads, and they can hand you back to yourself when you have been emptied out. The 42nd paradox is the memory return. After Stanley is wiped, the family begins to remind him of himself by going through the journals, by showing him photographs, by telling him stories about himself, and across the closing minutes of the episode he gradually recovers. The paradox is that there is no logical reason this should work. The memory gun, as the show has established, removes information cleanly. The memories should be gone, and yet they are not. They are sleeping. The narrative makes a deliberate choice, in the final act, to say that the gun did not really destroy what it claimed to destroy, that the things Stanley loved were stored somewhere deeper than the part of him the gun could reach. The paradox is the inconsistency the show is happy to live with. McGucket forgets, and his forgetting takes real years to undo. Stanley forgets, and his forgetting unwinds in an afternoon. The difference is, in the show's logic, that Stanley is loved by people who are present, who are willing to do the work of reconstructing him in real time, and McGucket spent his lost years alone. The paradox is that the memory gun's effectiveness, in the world of Gravity Falls, is in inverse proportion to the company you keep. The thing that protects you against being erased is the thing that nobody can technically measure, which is who is willing to remember you when you are gone. The 43rd paradox is the prophecy of the symbols on the journals. Each of the 3 journals carries a 6-fingered hand on its cover, palm out, marked with a number to identify which volume it is. And inside the larger geometry of the show, those hands are part of the wheel. The paradox is that the hands are physical objects, and the wheel they are part of is a magical arrangement, and the way the two interact suggests that Stanford was, even very early on, working with a vague sense of his own future. He did not know that he would later need a wheel, and yet the icons on the journals are, in retrospect, perfectly set up for one. Either he was unconsciously guided, perhaps by the same Bill who was unconsciously guiding so much else, or he was prescient in some quieter way, or the entire structure of the prophecy was retrofitted after the journals had already been designed, and the wheel exists because the icons did. The paradox is that you cannot tell from inside the show which way the causality runs. The icons fit the wheel, and the wheel fits the icons, and the show is silent on which came first. The 44th paradox is the language at the edges. Across both seasons, hidden in the background of the show, are messages written in a number of simple substitution ciphers, the names of which fans have cataloged, and the messages, when decoded, are often comments from the production team to the audience, or further hints about the lore, or thanks to viewers who have been paying attention. The paradox is whether these messages exist inside the world of the show or only outside it. From the audience's point of view, they are puzzles to be solved, fun Easter eggs left by Alex Hirsch and his writers. From inside the world, however, they are also written somewhere, on a wall, in a margin, in a credits card, and someone in the world wrote them. The show flirts with both readings. There are moments in the cipher messages that imply they are being written by someone within the universe of Gravity Falls, addressed to a future reader, and other moments in which they are clearly winks from the production. The paradox is the unstable layer between the show and its audience, the way the messages live in both places at once, and the implication, again, that everything in Gravity Falls means something, even when the meaning is just a friendly hello to whoever is watching. The 45th paradox is the cipher itself. The series has used a small library of substitution methods, Caesar shifts, letter-to-number mappings, @bash, and longer keyword ciphers, and the fan community has, over years, mapped almost every visible string in the show against this library. The paradox is the assumption underneath the entire exercise, which is that nothing in the design of the show is accidental, that every poster on a wall and every flicker in the credits is potentially encoded, and that an attentive enough viewer can in principle decode the show in full. That is a remarkable promise to make to an audience, and it implies a level of authorial care that almost no television production can sustain. The paradox is that the show, by all available evidence, very nearly did sustain it. The cipher community has decoded so many messages over so many episodes that the residual ambiguity at the edges has become its own kind of lore. A question of whether there is one last cipher nobody has yet found, whether a frame somewhere in the show contains a final message that only a future viewer will see. The show has not confirmed any such thing, but the paradox is that, because the show invited the search continues whether the show is finished or not. The 46th paradox is Soos. Throughout the show, Soos is treated as a kind of background fixture, a slightly grown man who works at the Mystery Shack and who exists primarily to provide gentle comic relief, and the show is, for most of its run, content to leave him there. The paradox is that Soos, more than any other character in the series, is the one whose interior the show keeps quietly opening. He is the only adult who plays with the twins as equals. He is the one who, in Blendin's game, has the worst single day of any character in the series, shown to you in flashback. He is the one who, by the end of the show, inherits the Mystery Shack and becomes its keeper. The paradox is the gap between his apparent role in the comedy and his actual role in the structure of the story. He is the heir. He is the steward. He is the person to whom the place is left, and the show only gradually lets you understand that this has been the plan from the beginning. The character who looked like a side joke is, in the long arc, the third Pines, the one without the blood and with the love. The paradox is that, when the family scatters at the end of the summer, the family business does not go to either of the Pines twins or to either of the older Pines brothers. It goes to Soos, and Soos is, by then, exactly the right person for it, and the show has been preparing you for this without telling you. The 47th paradox is the chosen one. There is a moment, late in the series, when an enchanted talisman or a moment of narrative gravity declares Soos to be a kind of chosen successor, And the paradox of that designation is that Soos chose himself first. Long before the show formalizes his role, he has spent years building the Mystery Shack with Stanley, has spent years caring about the family, has spent years being present in a way that no one else has been. The chosenness is not, in this reading, a magical accident. It is the slow accumulation of a choice he made every morning for years, which is the choice to show up. The paradox is the difference between fate and habit. Soos appears, to a casual viewer, to be chosen by destiny. He is, by a more careful reading, chosen by his own ordinary devotion, and the show is implying, quietly, that destiny in Gravity Falls is mostly what you call the things you have already done. The paradox is that, by the time the universe declares Soos the heir, the declaration is a formality. The job is already his. The 48th paradox is the father who is and is not. Soos's father, the man who failed to show up on his birthday, is barely a presence in the series, and yet his absence is the shape of half of Soos's character. Soos's relationship with Stanley is, the show implies, the relationship he did not have with his father, and the paradox is whether Stanley counts as a replacement or only as a substitute, the difference between the two being whether the original wound has been healed or merely covered. The show seems to argue both. It is honest enough about the wound to give Soos a moment, late in the series, when he is offered a chance to reconnect with his actual father, and refuses, on the grounds that the man does not deserve the access. And it is generous enough to let Stanley step into the gap in a way that visibly works, that lets Soos be the kind of son to him that he never was to anyone else. The paradox is the inheritance of a hurt and the inheritance of a healing in the same person. Soos is both, simultaneously, the boy abandoned by his father and the man chosen by a different older man as something close to a son, and the show is asking, very quietly, whether that arithmetic ever balances. The answer it offers is yes and no. Some hurts do not unhurt. Some loves do not undo what came before them. They just make the next part possible. The 49th paradox is Stanley's hidden generosity. The man you spend the first half of the show watching is presented as a cheapskate, a con man, a slightly cruel uncle who takes advantage of his great-niece and nephew for free labor and grudgingly tolerates their presence in his life. The paradox is the depth of what he is hiding underneath that surface, and the way the show forces you, episode by episode, to revise your reading of him. He is running an entire pretend life on top of a 30-year project of love. He is, by every measure that matters, a hero, a man who refused to give up on his brother for the entire span of his adult life, and the cover for that heroism is a stack of cheap merchandise and a cruel manner. The paradox is whether Stanley's act is necessary or merely habitual. The implication is that, after 30 years of being a different person on top of his actual self, the act has fused to him, that he no longer entirely knows where the persona ends and the person begins, and that the moment Stanford returns and the project is complete is also the moment when Stanley realizes he no longer has a script to follow. The hardest part of his life turns out to be the part after the rescue, when the lie is no longer required, and he has to work out who he was underneath it. The 50th paradox is the question of what Stanford did with 30 years. He was, by his own account, in a different dimension for a very long time, and during that time he had encounters and adventures and accumulated wisdom and equipment that he brings back with him. The paradox is the asymmetry. Stanley spent those decades on a small piece of land in Oregon, running a tourist trap, slowly losing his connection to the world. Stanford spent them somewhere else, somewhere stranger and larger, fighting whatever there is to fight in the multiverse. And yet, when he comes back, the difference between the two men is smaller than it should be. He is bruised, he is harder, he is a slightly different shape, but he is still recognizably the brother who left. The paradox is the resilience of personality across an experience that should, by rights, transform a person past recognition. The show seems to argue that what you are made of is, at the bottom, less malleable than the things that happen to you, that you can put a man through a multiverse and he will come out the other side still substantially himself. That is a comforting idea. It is also one that the show puts under quiet pressure, because Stanford's reunion with his brother is full of friction, and the friction is the proof that the years away mattered, that something has changed, even if the man on the surface looks the same. The 51st paradox is the price of the rescue. To bring Stanford back, Stanley reactivates the portal in the basement of the Mystery Shack, and the reactivation of the portal is the thing that makes Bill's plan possible. The paradox is the closure of the moral loop. Stanley, in his 30 years of trying to save his brother, has been unwittingly cooperating with the very entity his brother was trying to escape. The opening of the portal is, in the show's terms, the worst single act of the series, the event that allows Bill into our dimension, and the man responsible for it is also the man who has loved his brother enough to spend his life trying to find him. The paradox is the indistinguishability of love and damage. Stanley would not have opened the portal if he had not loved his brother that much. The opening of the portal nearly destroys the world. The two things cannot be separated, and the show refuses to let you separate them. The conclusion is hard. You cannot, in Gravity Falls, save the people you love without breaking something else. And you cannot break something without somebody you love being the one who breaks it. The 50-second paradox is the Stan War. Throughout the series, in flashbacks and in mentions, there is reference to a small boat that the Pines brothers built together as children, a boat called the Stan War, that they had planned to sail around the world together when they grew up. The boat is, in the early seasons, a piece of background color. The paradox is the slow realization as the series moves on that the boat is the destination of the entire emotional arc of the show. Stanley wanted the boat. Stanford wanted the boat. They fought, they were separated, they spent decades not speaking to each other, and at the end of the series, after everything, the closing montage shows them on the boat, sailing into the unknown. Finally, the paradox is the strange grace of a childhood dream that has waited a lifetime to come true. The brothers do not just reconcile. They reclaim a piece of themselves that they had each given up on, and the boat is the visible proof of it. The paradox is that, in a show built on time travel and impossible objects, the most satisfying paradox is the smallest one. A wooden boat, built by two children, has waited a lifetime for its passengers to be ready for it. It is still the boat they imagined. They are still the people they were when they imagined it. The 53rd paradox is the Lilliputians. There is an episode in which a population of small ceramic figures, originally part of a miniature golf course, are revealed to be alive and divided into tribes that war over the territory of the course. The paradox is the same one the gnomes raised at the start of the series, only deeper. These are not creatures with biology. They are golf course decorations made of porcelain, painted with simple shapes. The implication of their being alive is that anything in Gravity Falls that has been left alone long enough develops a personality. The town does this to objects. It does it to a wax figure of Sherlock Holmes. It does it to a barbershop quartet poster. It does it by implication to almost anything that has been sitting in one place long enough to attract whatever metaphysical residue the soil of the town produces. The paradox is the implication that the entire town is, in this sense, an enormous slow incubator. That the only reason every object in the shack and every chair in the diner is not also alive is that they have not yet been here long enough. That is a strange and slightly horrifying idea, and the show is comfortable letting you sit with it without ever making it explicit. The 54th paradox is the Summerween trickster. In an episode called Summerween, set partway through the first season, the town celebrates a kind of secondary Halloween in the middle of summer, and the antagonist of the episode is a creature called the Summerween trickster, who appears at first to be a man in a costume and is gradually revealed to be a kind of compost golem made of unloved candy. The paradox of the trickster is what he eats and what makes him. He is created, the show implies, from the candy that children rejected, the candy that nobody wanted, and his hunger is the hunger of a thing that has been thrown out. The paradox is that his solution to his condition is to eat children, that is, to make himself part of the very celebration that produced him. He is feeding back into a loop that was already turning. The episode has a moment, near the end, in which the trickster eats a piece of unloved candy from Dipper's bag and is pacified, and the implication is that he can be solved by being given exactly the food he was made of. That is a kind of paradox of recursion. He is the consequence of rejection, and he can be defeated by acceptance, and the acceptance is the thing that everybody refused him to begin with, which is why he exists. He is, in this reading, a small loop that the town has been running on itself for years, a creature of its own bad manners. The 55th paradox is the Northwest Curse. In an episode in the second season, an episode called Northwest Mansion Mystery, the family is invited to a high society party held by the wealthiest family in town, the Northwests, and the paradox of the episode is the long historical wound under the wealth. The Northwest fortune is revealed to have been founded on a broken promise that the family had once promised in exchange for the labor of the townspeople to one day open the mansion to the public, and that the promise has been silently buried for over a century. The ghost of the lumberjack who built the mansion, the show implies, has been waiting in the rafters all those years, looking for someone willing to keep the promise. The ghost of the lumberjack who built the mansion that was never met. The show treats it as both. The ghost is real, and the curse is real. And yet what releases both of them is just the descendant of the original Northwest family, a girl named Pacifica, choosing to open the mansion's doors at last. The paradox is that the supernatural in Gravity Falls keeps turning out to be ethical at the bottom, that the spirits in the walls of the town are mostly people waiting for a debt to be paid, and that the way to defeat them is, in almost every case, to do the right thing. The 56th paradox is the bell. The Northwest family, the show implies, controls their daughter Pacifica with a conditioned response, a small bell that they ring whenever she behaves in a way they wish to correct. And the conditioning is so deep that her body responds to the bell before her conscience can. The paradox of the bell is the fact that, by the end of the episode, Pacifica has not entirely escaped its grip. She has chosen, in one moment, to defy her parents. She has chosen to open the mansion. But the bell, as an object, is still in their possession. The implication is that the choice she made was a single act of will against a system that has not been dismantled, that she will go home that night to parents who still have the bell, and that the next time she is told to flinch, she may flinch again. The show does not let her have a clean victory, it lets her have a hard one. The paradox is the difference between a single choice and a freed self, and the show is honest enough to acknowledge that they are not the same thing. The bell is still in the mansion, the story is not over. The paradox is that the most you can sometimes do in a single episode is to make the next choice possible, and the show is willing to leave a child standing in that gap. The 57th paradox is Gideon's redemption. Across the first season, Gideon is one of the main antagonists of the show, a small child psychic who is trying to take the deed to the Mystery Shack and possibly to marry Mabel in some grotesque future scheme. He is, in any sober reading, a child villain. By the end of the second season, however, the show has begun to soften him, to show his loneliness, to give him a moment of choosing the right thing when nobody is watching. The paradox is the rapidity of the rehabilitation. The show, in the space of a few episodes, asks you to accept that this child is not, after all, beyond saving. The slower paradox underneath is whether his rehabilitation is real or merely strategic. He helps the family, he sides with them in the climactic battle, he ends the series freed from prison and, on the surface, less harmful than he started. But the show does not give him a personality transplant. He is still the same boy, with the same sense of theater, and the paradox is whether goodness, in a character like Gideon, is a real shift or only a redirected energy. The show offers you both readings and lets you choose, and the generosity of letting Gideon end the show ambiguously is itself part of the writing's confidence. The 58th paradox is the tent of telepathy. Gideon's father runs a small tent in the center of town where Gideon performs his psychic act, and the paradox of the tent is the question of what the father actually believes. He is shown, through the show, to be aware that the act is partly fake, to be aware that his son is also genuinely strange, and to be willing to weaponize the strangeness for profit while resenting his son for being the source of it. He is, in this reading, both impresario and prisoner of his own child, both the manager of the act and the audience for it. The paradox is the small private theater at the center of the family, the gap between what the father knows and what he is allowed to say, and the long quiet pressure of that gap on a man who appears, on the surface, to be only a slightly seedy small-town operator. The tent of telepathy is not just a stage, it is the location of a low-grade, ongoing emotional emergency. And the paradox is that nobody in the town seems to notice. They go for the readings. They pay their $1. They walk out without looking at the man at the back of the room, and his son grows up worse year by year. The 59th paradox is the hand witch. There is a character introduced briefly in the second season, a witch with mismatched hands, who is described as keeping a collection of severed hands and using them for her work. The paradox is one of inclusion. She appears in the show, she is named, she is given a moment of menace, and she then largely disappears from the central plot. The show is full of these characters, figures whose presence implies a much larger world than the series has time to map. Each one of them is, in some sense, the center of an episode that was never made, a story that lives only as a single moment of background. The paradox is the implied universe outside the frame. Gravity Falls, on screen, is a town with a handful of named eccentric residents. Gravity Falls, by implication, is a town with hundreds of such residents, each with a private supernatural life of their own, each carrying around the residue of an encounter they have not told you about. The paradox is the density of stories the show is choosing not to tell. There is a witch in the woods with a bag of hands, and you do not know who she was before. You do not know what she will do tomorrow. The show is generous enough to let her exist without explaining her. The 60th paradox is the lake monster. In the second episode of the first season, an episode called The Legend of the Gobblewonker, the kids spend the day on a lake in pursuit of a creature that is reported to live in the water. The paradox of the episode is that the monster, when finally found, turns out to be a robot, a machine built by old man McGucket as part of his own confused project to win back the love of a son. The paradox is the layering. The lake does contain a monster, in some narrow sense, but the monster is not what the legend says it is. The legend is a story. The truth is a sad old man with a robot. And yet, in the later seasons, the show is willing to fill the same lake with other strange things, suggests that the original Gobblewonker may have had a real basis somewhere upstream of the legend, and never quite confirms whether the legend is a story made up about a real creature or whether the only creature is the one McGucket built. The paradox is the way the show layers explanations on top of each other. There is always the obvious answer, the boring answer, and the deeper answer, and the show is happy to let you have any of the three, depending on how patient you are willing to be. The 61st paradox is the floating cliffs. In a number of episodes in the second season, certain natural features around Gravity Falls are shown to be subtly impossible. Geological formations that should not exist, cliffs that float a small distance off the ground, rocks that hum, hills that move when nobody is looking. The paradox is the integration of the impossible into the landscape. Stanford's journals imply, and the show confirms, that the entire area around Gravity Falls sits on top of an unusually thin barrier between dimensions, that the supernatural is bleeding through the soil, and that the geography of the town is therefore in some sense not entirely solid. The paradox is what this should mean for any kind of cartography. You cannot map Gravity Falls in any conventional sense, because the map will be out of date in ways you cannot see. The town is, in a strange way, alive, in the same way the Lilliputians are alive, in the same way the wax figures briefly were. The implication is that you cannot ever entirely know where you are, and the paradox is the calmness with which the residents accept this. They have stopped noticing. The map has been wrong for so long that wrong is the new right. The 60-second paradox is the eye-bats. During Weirdmageddon, Bill releases a swarm of small flying creatures, each of which is, essentially, an eye on wings, called eye-bats. They patrol the town, they petrify anyone they look at directly, and they enforce the new order. The paradox is what the eye-bats are. They are not part of the cosmology Bill has been described in. They are not creatures from his dimension, as far as the show specifies. They appear at the moment of Weirdmageddon and disappear at its end, and the implication is that they are a kind of spontaneous emanation of Bill's presence, that he generates them simply by being in the world. The paradox is what it means for a creature to be made of its master's attention. The eye-bats are, in this reading, looking at the town because Bill is looking at the town, and you cannot escape one without escaping the other. The closer reading is that everything in Weirdmageddon is, in some sense, Bill himself, that the entire landscape during those episodes is a projection of his mind, and that the townspeople are walking around inside an enemy's head. That is one of the most claustrophobic concepts the show offers. The paradox is that you are not under attack from outside, you are inside the attacker. The 63rd paradox is the pyramid. The structure Bill builds for himself during Weirdmageddon, a giant pyramid floating above the town, is called the pyramid, and the paradox of it is the question of where the materials came from. The town has not been demolished to build it. There are not visible quarries. There is no construction process shown. The pyramid arrives, the way Bill arrives, fully formed, and sits in the sky as if it had always been there. The implication is that the pyramid is, like the eye-bats, an emanation rather than a building, that it has been pulled into existence from somewhere other than the local matter, that Bill, when he has enough access to a region, can simply summon the architecture he wants. The paradox is what this implies about the rest of the world. If matter can be summoned, then matter can presumably be banished. The fact that the pyramid disappears when Bill is defeated suggests that this is indeed how it works, and the paradox is that the town, after Weirdmageddon, does not visibly lose any of its own matter. The pyramid arrives and departs without taking the local landscape with it, and the implication is that it was never really here. The town has been haunted by a building that did not exist. That is a strange thing to have happened to a town, and the show, characteristically, lets you absorb the implication without underlining it. The 64th paradox is the henchmaniacs. Bill enters our dimension with a crew of strange beings, his old companions from his home dimension, each of them a different small horror. They have names, they have personalities, they have a brief on-screen presence during Weirdmageddon, and they are then defeated alongside Bill. The paradox is who these creatures were before Bill found them, and the show does not tell you. They appear as a finished band. They are loyal to him, they fight for him, they laugh at his jokes, and they have, by implication, spent some unimaginable length of time traveling with him through whatever spaces exist outside our universe. The paradox is the social life of a being like Bill, who is described as outside time and outside space, and who has, somehow, friends. The implication is that even an entity of Bill's scale needs an audience, that the fearsome cosmic god is also, in a smaller and stranger sense, a slightly lonely creature who has gathered a small group of similarly unmoored beings around him. The henchmaniacs are, in this reading, not so much soldiers as companions, and the paradox is that the worst creature in the show is also the only one to bring a posse, and the posse is fond of him. He is loved, in some debased sense, by the things he travels with, and the paradox is that even monsters have friends. The 65th paradox is the way the town remembers. After Weirdmageddon ends, the show implies that the people of Gravity Falls do not entirely retain their memories of the catastrophe, that the trauma is dampened, that the day-to-day life of the town resumes with only a vague sense of having been through something. The paradox is whether this is a kindness or a violence. The Blind Eye Society and its memory gun are, by this point in the series, established as a moral problem. To forget what was done to you is to lose the right to make sense of it. And yet the show seems to suggest that, after Weirdmageddon, a partial forgetting is necessary for the town to function, that to remember the eye-bats and the pyramid and the gold-plated bodies in the throne room in any detail would simply be more than a person could carry. The paradox is that the same mechanism the show has been criticizing for the whole of the second season turns out, at the end, to be the thing that allows life to continue. The forgetting is mercy. The forgetting is also theft. The show does not resolve this. It just shows you the town walking back into its own ordinary days, and you are left to decide for yourself whether the people on screen have been protected or robbed. The 66th paradox is the question of why the summer ends. The series is structured around a single summer, from the day the twins arrive in Gravity Falls to the day they leave, and the show is enormously deliberate about that frame. There are 40 episodes, give or take, plus shorts, and they map a single seasonal arc, and the paradox is that the season's ending is presented as inevitable, even though the show has spent 2 seasons demonstrating that the universe is largely negotiable. The kids can travel in time. The kids can survive multiverses. The kids can defeat a higher dimensional demon. And yet, when the summer ends, they get on a bus and go home, because the calendar says so. The paradox is the local force of the ordinary inside a show that has otherwise insisted on breaking ordinary rules. The end of the summer is not, in this reading, a real boundary, but the show treats it as one anyway, because the show is, at the bottom, about growing up. You can do almost anything in a Gravity Falls summer except keep it from ending. The paradox is that the most powerful force in the show is also the most quiet one, which is the slow drift of a season into autumn, and there is no spell that turns that drift around. The 67th paradox is the bus stop. In the final episode, the kids are waiting for the bus that will take them home to their parents, and the entire town has come out to see them off. The paradox of the bus stop is the strange weight of the goodbye. The kids are going home for the school year. They will, the show implies, return to Gravity Falls again. This is not, on the surface, a permanent parting, and yet the goodbye is shot with the seriousness of a permanent parting, with the music underneath it pitched the way music is pitched at the end of an era, and the implication is that something has changed that cannot be reversed by their coming back next summer. The paradox is the difference between the calendar and the threshold. Next year is, on the calendar, only a year away. But the kids will be older, the town will be different, the people in it will have moved on, and the version of Gravity Falls they will return to will not be the version they are leaving. The paradox is that the goodbye is not really to a place. It is to a particular configuration of time, to a single specific summer, and that configuration cannot be visited a second time, no matter how reliable the bus. The 68th paradox is the photograph in the Mystery Shack. Across the show, in the background of various shots in the shack, there is a small framed photograph or two of the family, and the paradox is the longer story of these pictures. By the end of the series, the family in the photographs has expanded. There are now versions of the family that include Stanford, that include Soos, that include the twins, and the implication is that the photographs have been replaced or updated as the family has grown back together. The paradox is the small archival work of an unhealed family slowly becoming a healed one, and the way the show lets you read that archive in the background of any given scene. You can, if you watch carefully, track the recovery of the family by which photographs are on the walls of the shack. The paradox is that the most important historical record in the show is in the corner of the frame, and you have to be paying attention to see it. The 69th paradox is the parents. Dipper and Mabel are sent to Gravity Falls for the summer by their parents, who appear briefly in the very first episode and then disappear from the show for the entire run of the series. The paradox is the strange absence of the parents from a story so deeply concerned with family. The show has time for two great uncles, a beloved older friend, a slightly tragic father figure for Soos, and almost no time at all for the actual parents of the central children. The implication is that the parents are not the family the story is about. The family the story is about is the chosen one, the one composed of older men and adopted brothers and great uncles who were strangers a few weeks ago. The paradox is that, in Gravity Falls, the most important parental figures for the twins are not their parents, and the show is comfortable with this. It is, in fact, the spine of the story. The summer is the summer the twins discover, without ever quite saying it, that family is wider than the household they came from, that the people who matter to you can include the people you have only just met, and that absence is something a person can grow up around without breaking. The 70th paradox is the great uncle problem. In the closing minutes of the series, after Bill is defeated, the twins return home, and Stanford and Stanley sail away on the Stan War to explore the world together. The paradox is what this leaves the twins with. They have, over the course of the summer, formed an extremely deep attachment to two old men, and the old men are now removing themselves from the central location of that attachment. The twins are going back to a house without them, to a school year without them, to a life that will be defined, from now on, by the long stretches between visits. The paradox is whether this is a sad ending or a joyful one. The show frames it as joyful. The brothers have their boat, the kids have their adventure, the cycle has closed. But the show is also honest about the cost. The twins are going to miss their uncles. The uncles are going to miss the twins. The paradox is that the right ending here, the ending where everyone gets the thing they want, is also an ending where everyone is going to be slightly lonely. The show does not pretend otherwise. The 71st paradox is the Stan twins' faces. Across the first season, before the reveal in A Tale of Two Stans, the show has had to keep one of the most important pieces of its mythology hidden. And the way it does this is by simply never letting you see Stanford's face. The portrait of him in the shack is positioned at an angle. The flashbacks during this period are clipped. The framing is careful. The paradox is the long, quiet work of misdirection the show has been doing without telling you. By the time you find out that there are two Stans, you can go back through the first season and see, in retrospect, all the places where the show has been working to keep you from finding out. And the paradox is that you did not notice while you were watching. The show was hiding the central piece of its mythology in plain sight, and you accepted the camera angles as ordinary. That is a particular kind of trick that is almost only available to animation, where every frame is a deliberate choice. And the paradox is that the show was, the whole time, treating the audience like the kind of close reader it eventually rewarded. The 72nd paradox is the date. The show is set, by its internal calendar, during a single summer that fans have identified, by various background clues and aired air dates, as a specific year. And the paradox of the date is that the show treats the present day as both a precise time and a slightly fuzzy one. The technology in the Mystery Shack is, in places, deliberately old. Stanley's habits are those of a much earlier decade. The newspapers in the background of certain episodes contain headlines from many different eras. The implication is that Gravity Falls, as a town, is not entirely synchronized with the calendar of the outside world, that things in it lag, that some objects in it are out of time in the way certain rural towns can be, where a barbershop has not changed its signage in 50 years. The paradox is the small atemporal pocket the town represents inside the larger flow of history. The show is, again, comfortable letting the implications sit. You cannot quite place Gravity Falls in any year. You can place it in a season, but the season is itself a kind of soft loop, repeating across decades for the people who live there, and the only thing that moves through it cleanly is the children, who arrive and grow up. The 73rd paradox is the journal handwriting. Stanford writes in a precise, slightly archaic hand. The journals are, by the show's logic, written over a number of years, and yet the hand in them is largely consistent. The paradox is the long discipline of the writing. To keep the same hand across a decade of writing is hard. To keep it across a decade of writing in increasing emotional distress, in different rooms, in different states of mind, is almost impossible. And yet the journals do this. They are visually unified in a way that implies the man writing them was unusually devoted to the act of keeping them, that he treated the act of inscription itself as a stabilizing ritual, that there was something about the discipline of writing in a particular hand that helped him hold himself together when the things he was writing about were trying to break him. The paradox is the way the journals function, on the level of penmanship, as a kind of meditation. They were not just records. They were, for Stanford, the thing that kept him being himself, and you can read the deterioration in them by reading where the hand begins to wobble. The 74th paradox is the warnings. The journals contain, in various places, warnings written in a different style, in red, in larger letters, in a hand that is clearly more agitated than the surrounding text. The paradox is whether these warnings are written by Stanford to himself, by a future Stanford to a past Stanford, or by some third intelligence operating on the page. The simplest reading is that Stanford added warnings retroactively when he understood things he had not understood at the time. The slightly more interesting reading is that something else was occasionally able to touch the pen. Bill, throughout the series, is shown to be able to affect the dream world and the physical world in small, precise ways. And the paradox is whether some of the warnings in the journals are not warnings at all, but bait, additions made by Bill in moments when he had access, designed to push Stanford in particular directions. The show does not confirm this, but the paradox is that the journals are not a single voice. They are a conversation, possibly between Stanford and himself, possibly between Stanford and his enemy, and the reader cannot always tell which is which. The 75th paradox is the bunker. The shapeshifter's chamber is only one room in a larger underground complex that Stanford built beneath the forest. A complex full of laboratories, sleeping quarters, supply caches, evidence of years of secret residence. The paradox is the scale of what one man could have built alone. Stanford, by the timeline the show implies, would have been working on the bunker in parallel with the portal, in parallel with the journals, in parallel with whatever ordinary survival he was managing in a small mountain town. The energy required to do all of this without any visible support is enormous. The implication is either that Stanford was, in the early years of his project, working far harder than any single person can reasonably work, or that he had help that the show does not name, or that something else was building alongside him. The paradox is the unsourced productivity of the author's underground architecture, and the show is comfortable letting that be a quiet wonder. He built it. You do not entirely know how. The 76th paradox is the gravity of the falls themselves. The town is named, by all available evidence, after a waterfall. There is a waterfall on the edge of town. There is a sense, throughout the series, that the falls are a feature in the landscape that the show occasionally circles back to, that they are part of the town's identity. The paradox is whether the name describes the waterfall, or whether the waterfall describes the name. Gravity Falls, as a phrase, is also a kind of statement of physics, a claim that, in this place, gravity itself is unreliable. The show, with its floating cliffs and its interdimensional bleed, half supports this reading. The implication is that the town is named after a phenomenon, and the waterfall is just a landmark, that the local gravity does, on a long enough timescale, fall, and that the town has been built on top of this small instability. The paradox is the way the name carries both meanings without committing to either. and the way the show, in any given episode, leans into one reading or the other, depending on what it needs. The waterfall is real. The metaphor is also real. The name is doing both jobs at once. The 77th paradox is the cosmic eye of the credits. At the end of certain episodes, in the closing credits, a small cryptogram appears, and at the bottom of the cryptogram is, in many cases, the image of an eye. The paradox is whether the eye in the credits is the same eye as the eye on Bill, or whether it is a different eye, the eye of the show watching itself. The implication is, again, both. The credits, in this reading, are inside the world of the show in some sense, and the eye is Bill keeping his attention on the audience, even after the episode has technically ended. There are moments in the credits where the camera lingers on the eye in a way that suggests the show wants you to feel watched. The paradox is the long shadow of Bill across the closing seconds of every episode. He is in the lore, he is in the cipher, he is in the eye on the credit card, and the implication is that, for as long as you are watching Gravity Falls, you are inside the radius of his attention. He sees you watching him. The paradox is the cleverness of that, the way the show implicates the audience in its own ongoing surveillance, and the way you, watching this, are part of the experiment. The 78th paradox is the audience. The series is unusually direct about its relationship with its viewers. There are characters who address the camera. There are codes designed to be solved by viewers at home. There are Easter eggs whose meaning only emerges if a large enough community decides to look for them. The paradox is what this implies about the show's epistemology of itself. Gravity Falls is, in part, a show that is only finished when its audience finishes it. The codes, until solved, are dormant. The implications, until discussed, are unfixed. The lore, until cataloged, is incomplete. The paradox is the strange agency of the audience inside the work. The show is not closed. It is a partially open object, and the people watching it are doing some of the work of making it real. That is a metaphysical statement, embedded in a children's cartoon, and the paradox is the casualness with which the show offers it. You are not just watching. You are, in some small sense, finishing the writing. The author left the journals so they could be found by Dipper. The show left the codes so they could be found by you. The 79th paradox is the small joke that becomes a key. There are running gags in Gravity Falls that, on first watch, look like throwaway bits of comedy, and that, on closer inspection, turn out to be carrying important information. A small line about a particular shape, a recurring number, a small visual motif, all of these turn out, by the end of the series, to have been hints at the larger structure. The paradox is the unstable boundary between joke and clue. You cannot tell, while you are watching, which of the gags are decoration and which are scaffolding. The show is comfortable with this. It is willing to bury its most important information inside its silliest moments, because it knows that the audience will, on rewatch, sort the difference out. The paradox is that almost any frame of the show is, in principle, doing two jobs at once. It is making you laugh now, and it is preparing the ground for something later. And the only way to fully appreciate the show is to watch it backwards as well as forwards. The paradox is that the second watch is in many ways the first watch, and the first watch is just rehearsal. The 80th paradox is the cryptogram that does not decode. There are, here and there in the show, a small number of pieces of background text or imagery that the fan community has been unable to definitively decode. And the paradox of these is whether they are messages that simply have not been solved, or whether they were never meant to be messages at all. The show, in interviews and in its later supplementary materials, has tended to imply that almost everything is a message. The fans have therefore continued to look, even at fragments that look most like decoration. The paradox is that you cannot be sure, in Gravity Falls, when something is meaningless. The default assumption is that there is something to find, and the default failure mode is to find something that is not there. The show is comfortable with this, and there is a long tradition of fan theories that have been quietly abandoned because no second piece of evidence ever arrived to support them. The paradox is the ratio between confirmed and unconfirmed information in the show's lore, the long tail of half-decoded ideas that have lingered for years in fan discussions without ever being either accepted or refuted, and the way this tale is, in some ways, the most important part of the show's afterlife. The 81st paradox is the cipher hunt. After the series ended, the creator launched a real-world treasure hunt across multiple countries, asking fans to follow clues to find a statue of Bill Cipher hidden in the woods of Oregon. The paradox of the Cipher hunt is the deliberate bleed of the show into the real world. The fans who solved it were doing, in 3 dimensions, what Dipper had been doing on screen: decoding messages, traveling to physical locations, finding objects placed there by an author who had gone before them. The Bill statue, when found, was a real object in a real forest, and the paradox is whether finding it counted as part of the show. The show was over, the credits had rolled, and yet a piece of its mythology was sitting in the real world, waiting to be discovered. And when it was discovered, the people who found it were both audience members and characters at the same time. The paradox is the way the Cipher hunt let the show keep happening after it had ended, the way it gave the audience a final chapter to write themselves, and the way the statue, by being found, became, retroactively, part of the canon. Bill in the woods was real. Bill in the show was a drawing. The fans had touched both. The 80-second paradox is the statue itself, sitting in stone, in the woods, waiting. Inside the show, at the very end of Weirdmageddon, there is a moment in which the defeated Bill, dropping into Stanley's mind to be erased, leaves behind a small stone version of himself in the forest, frozen mid-gesture. The statue is described in the lore as a kind of seed, as a place where Bill is technically still present, suspended, waiting to be brought back if anyone ever offers him a handshake. The paradox of the statue is the open ending it represents. The show is over, Bill is defeated, but the statue is still in the woods, and the implication is that, if the right person comes along and shakes its hand, the entire story might begin again. The show does not pursue this. The statue is left there. The paradox is the calmness with which the show acknowledges that defeat is not final, that the enemy can always be reactivated, and that the only thing keeping Gravity Falls safe is the fact that nobody, so far, has been foolish enough to make the deal a second time. The 83rd paradox is the small chance of a sequel. The show has been off the air for many years by the time of this video, and yet the lore has continued to grow, in companion books, in interviews, in the Cipher hunt, in the small additional details supplied by the creator. The paradox is the open-ended afterlife of a show that, by its own narrative standards, ended completely. The kids went home. The portal was closed. The brothers sailed away. There was nothing more to tell. And yet there is always, in interviews, the slight gesture of the creator toward more material, the implication that the world of Gravity Falls is not entirely closed, and the paradox is that the audience has been waiting, for years now, on the edge of a sequel that may or may not arrive. The show ended, and yet it has not entirely ended, and the paradox is the strange suspended life it lives in the gap between those two states. The closing of a story can apparently be undone, in television, by the simple act of a creator saying perhaps. The paradox is that the perhaps is itself part of the story's ending. The 84th paradox is the Book of Bill. A companion book published years after the show's conclusion expands the mythology, fills in some of the cosmology, gives Bill a longer backstory, attempts to address some of the unanswered questions. The paradox is what the book is allowed to do to the show. It cannot, by its nature, override what is on screen. The show is the canon. The book is supplementary. And yet the book, by virtue of being written by the creator, has the power to shift the meaning of certain on-screen moments, to imply backwards through the series, to alter the way you read scenes that, before the book, you had read differently. The paradox is the unstable canonicity of supplementary materials. They are part of the lore, and they are not part of the show. They cannot, strictly speaking, change anything, and yet they do, in the sense that they change what you think about while you are watching. The paradox is the way authorship continues after a show has ended, the way the creator can continue to whisper into the ear of the audience, and the way each whisper becomes, slowly, indistinguishable from the original work. The 85th paradox is the axolotl. In the climactic episode, Bill, in his last moments before being erased by the memory gun, speaks a strange incantation, a kind of rhyme, addressed to an entity called the axolotl. The axolotl is not, in the show, ever properly introduced. It is named only in this final moment. It is implied to be, by fan consensus and later supplementary writing, some kind of higher being, possibly one capable of granting Bill some form of resurrection or continuity. The paradox is what the show is doing by introducing a brand new piece of cosmology in the last seconds of a long arc. Either the axolotl is a real character, in which case the show has been hiding a major piece of the universe for 40 episodes, or the axolotl is a flourish, a final gesture, a last bit of mystery to leave the door cracked. The fan community has, predictably, spent years investigating the axolotl. The supplementary materials have given it slightly more detail, and the paradox is that the show has invented an entity whose only function is to be a question mark. The axolotl is a name that exists to keep the story unclosed. The paradox is the strange power of a single mention. One sentence in one episode has launched years of speculation, and the show, by not following up, has made that sentence one of the most discussed lines in the series. The 86th paradox is the multiverse. The show, in the second season, makes increasingly clear that our universe is one of many, that Bill's home dimension is just another room in a much larger cosmology, that Stanford spent his 30 years traveling through a long series of different worlds, each with its own physics. The paradox of the multiverse, as the show presents it, is the question of significance. If there are many worlds, then the loss of any one of them is, in some sense, mathematical. Bill destroys multiple dimensions across his career. Is the show presents it, and yet the show, when it depicts these losses, depicts them with sorrow, treats each dimension as if it mattered, refuses to let the abundance of worlds make any single one disposable. The paradox is the difference between the multiverse as a setting and the multiverse as a moral framework. The show is not a nihilist about the multiverse. It refuses to use the largeness of the cosmology as a reason for indifference. The paradox is the choice of weight. Every world counts, even when there are infinite worlds, because the people inside any one of them only have that one. The show, very gently, is asking you to apply that reading to the world you are actually in. The 87th paradox is the dream. Bill lives in the dream world, and the dream world, in the show, is described as a real place that all dreamers visit, a kind of shared subconscious geography. The paradox is the publicness of the private. Your dream, in the world of Gravity Falls, is not entirely yours. It is a room you walk into, and other dreamers are in the room, and creatures who do not sleep can sit in the room and watch you. The paradox is the implication for ordinary dreaming. If the dream world is real, and other beings can occupy it, then every night, every person on Earth, in the world of the show, is walking into a public space and putting their inner life on display. Bill is the most dramatic intruder in that space, but he cannot be the only one. The paradox is the much larger possibility that the show implies and does not pursue, which is that the dream world is full, that there are countless small entities operating in it, and that the human relationship with sleep is therefore much stranger than the waking life suggests. The show is content to leave this implication mostly silent. The dream is a real place. You are visited in it. That is the world Gravity Falls assumes, and the paradox is the everyday horror of accepting that, without being able to do anything about it. He enters the dream by being summoned, and the summoning, in the show, requires a small ritual, a circle of candles, a chant, a piece of paper with the right symbols. The paradox is that the ritual is performable by an amateur. Stanford does it. Gideon does it. Anyone who has access to the journals can, in principle, do it. The implication is that Bill is sitting just outside the dream wall, waiting for an invitation, and that the invitation is not difficult to issue. A creature this dangerous should not, by any reasonable design, be summonable by a child with a candle. And yet, that is precisely the access the show specifies. The implication is that Bill has been designed, by whatever logic governs his existence, to be available to the curious, that his entire model relies on someone being lonely enough or angry enough to call him, and that the door he sits behind is, by his own choice, deliberately easy to open. The paradox is the marketing strategy of a higher dimensional demon. He is easy to summon because he wants to be summoned. The hard part of getting Bill into your life is not finding him. The hard part is making him leave. The 89th paradox is the strange behavior of Dream Stan. When Bill is inside Stan's mind in Dreamscaperers, the inner architecture of Stan's mind is shown to be unexpectedly elaborate, full of rooms, full of memories, full of repressed details that Dipper and Mabel and Soos move through in the course of the episode. The paradox is the visualization of an inner life that the surface of Stan has spent years denying. The man you have been watching for 19 episodes has been telling everyone, including himself, that he does not care about much of anything, that he is, at his core, a small-minded showman, and then his mind is opened up, and the inside of it is full of love, of fear for his family, of a lifetime of regret. The paradox is the contrast between the surface and the structure, and the way the episode lets you walk through one to see the other. The show is making a point, very gently, about what people are. The thing they tell you they are is, often, a kind of front office. The thing they actually are is the basement, and the basement is much bigger than the front office, and most of it never gets visited by anyone. The paradox is that Stan's mind is enormous, and only his great-niece and nephew have ever, even briefly, seen the inside of it. The 90th paradox is the way Bill cannot read Stan's mind. There is a moment in the Dreamscaperers episode where Bill is searching for a particular memory inside Stan, the combination to a safe, and Stan, by sheer force of will, manages to bury the memory deep enough that Bill cannot easily find it. The paradox is the implication of an inner space that a higher dimensional being cannot fully penetrate. Bill is, in his self-description, an entity that can see across time and space, and yet a stubborn old man in a small Oregon town can hide a fact from him. The implication is that the mind, in the cosmology of Gravity Falls, has a kind of integrity that even the universe's worst creatures cannot fully overrule. There is a place in you that is yours. Bill can pressure you, can possess you, can bargain with you, but he cannot, against your will, read the deepest pages. The paradox is the small dignity of the human inner life inside a show that is otherwise willing to violate almost every other privacy. You are not entirely available, even to a creature outside time. The show is offering this as a quiet kind of hope, and the paradox is that the hope is shaped like an old man refusing to look at a particular memory while a demon stands over him. The 91st paradox is the way Bill courts. He does not simply approach his targets, he cultivates them. He listens to them in dreams, he flatters them, he sympathizes with their resentments, he gives them ideas they think are their own. He positions himself as a confidant. The paradox is that this is, on the surface, indistinguishable from a kind of friendship. The first half of Bill's relationship with Stanford is, by all available evidence, mutually warm. He is helpful. He is interesting. He gives the man an audience he has been starved of. The paradox is the long con of intimacy. By the time Stanford realizes what Bill is, he has already given him everything he needed, and the realization comes too late to be useful. The show is, in this, making a quiet point about a real category of bad relationship. The worst people in your life rarely arrive announcing themselves. They arrive as the only person who seems to understand you, and they leave with everything you were carrying. The paradox is that the most consistently dangerous thing about Bill is not his power, it is his charm. The 92nd paradox is the small bowler hat. Bill, in his depictions, wears a small black bowler hat and carries a thin cane, and the paradox of the costume is the question of what it is doing on him. He is a being from outside three-dimensional space. He is, by every available measure, beyond the conventions of clothing, and yet he wears, very precisely, the costume of a stage magician from the early 20th century, with all the showmanship and all the menace that the costume implies. The implication is that Bill has chosen this look. He has dressed himself, in the way he wishes to be seen by humans, in the most theatrical and the most easily readable form of villain available to him. He is, in effect, cosplaying as the devil. The paradox is that the choice is part of the character. He is a creature of attention, and he wants to be looked at, and he is dressed for the part. The hat and the cane are not incidental design. They are a statement. He wants you to recognize him. He wants you to be afraid of him. He wants you to know, the second he appears, exactly who has entered the room, and the costume is doing that work. The paradox is that the most dangerous creature in the show is also, in some ways, the vainest. The 93rd paradox is the moment Bill blinks. He has a single large eye, and the paradox of the eye is that it occasionally closes. There are frames in the show where Bill blinks, where his eye briefly shuts, where for a fraction of a second he is, technically, blind. The paradox is what this implies about his attention. If Bill is truly omniscient, the eye does not need to close. The blink is, in this reading, a performance, a piece of theater to make him legible to humans, a way of having a face. The slightly stranger reading is that the blink is real, that there are small intervals in which Bill is, in fact, not looking, that there are seams in his attention that a sufficiently clever opponent could exploit. The show does not commit. The blink is a tiny, ambiguous gesture in the visual design. The paradox is that the most powerful creature in the show may not always be looking, and that the cracks in his attention may be the place where a defeat becomes possible. Whether this is the case or not, the show does not say. The eye closes and the eye opens, and you do not entirely know what passed in between. The 94th paradox is the way the show ends without ending. The final episode does not, in its closing moments, attempt to wrap up every loose thread. The axolotl is not explained. The statue is not destroyed. The wider world's awareness of Gravity Falls is not addressed. The fate of certain side characters is left unspecified. The paradox is the deliberate openness of the conclusion. The show could, in the time available, have closed every door. It chose not to. It chose to leave a number of small openings, in the certainty that the audience would find them, that the lore community would continue to pry at them for years, that the show would continue to live in conversation long after it had stopped airing. The paradox is the difference between a story that finishes and a story that ends. Gravity Falls finishes. The summer is over. The family is reunited. The threat is gone. But the story does not entirely end. The doors are propped open. And the paradox is that the show seems to understand that this is a kindness to the audience. The 95th paradox is the long shadow of Alex Hirsch. The creator of the show has, in interviews and supplementary materials and the Cipher Hunt and the Book of Bill, continued to be present in the show's afterlife in a way that few creators of similar projects manage. The paradox is the question of authorship in a finished work. The show is over. The episodes will not change. But the creator, by virtue of continuing to talk about the show, to add details, to confirm or deny readings, exerts a kind of ongoing force on what the show means. He is the author of the journals in a meta-sense. He is the one who knows where the bodies are buried, and he is the one occasionally pointing at a particular floorboard. The paradox is the strange afterlife of authorship, the way a creator can continue to be present in a work for decades after the production has ended, and the way each new comment subtly retunes the audience's relationship with the original material. The show, in this sense, is not entirely a finished object. It is a living document, and the creator is, even now, still occasionally writing in the margins. The show ended in 2016, which, by the date of this video, is now about a decade ago, and the paradox is the strange velocity with which the show has aged into a kind of classic. It has become, for a generation that watched it as children, a touchstone for a particular kind of childhood, and for a generation that watched it as adults, a measure of what a children's cartoon can do at the highest end of its capacity. The paradox is the way the cultural memory of the show has expanded in the years since it ended, the way it has become, for many people, larger in retrospect than it was at the time. The show was 40 episodes. It was not, by any production standard, an enormous undertaking, and yet the place it occupies in the memory of its viewers is much larger than its actual length. And the paradox is the disproportion. The thing that a person feels about Gravity Falls 10 years later is bigger than the thing the show is. The implication is that the show has become a vessel for something else, for a feeling about a particular summer of one's own, for the memory of being 12, for the way television used to feel before the algorithm took it over, and the show has been generous enough to hold all of that without buckling. The 97th paradox is the way the show was never quite a hit. It was a successful show, it was beloved by a devoted audience, but it never reached the absolute mainstream cultural saturation that other animated series have achieved. And the paradox is the relationship between its modest commercial scale and its outsized cultural footprint. The show is, in this sense, a kind of cult phenomenon, in a way that few cartoons get to be. It has the depth of fandom of a much larger property, the lore community of a much larger property, the merchandise tale of a much larger property, and yet it has these things from a comparatively small base of episodes and a comparatively small original audience. The paradox is the leverage of quality over quantity. The show produced more meaning per episode than almost anything around it at the time, and that meaning has continued to pay dividends years later, and the result is a show that punches considerably above its commercial weight in the culture. The paradox is that nobody producing the show, at the time, had any guarantee that this would happen. They simply made the best version of the show they could, and the audience, slowly, decided that it would be enormous in retrospect. The 98th paradox is the way the show treats childhood. Across 40 episodes, Gravity Falls is unflinching about the fact that childhood is going to end. It treats its main characters as people whose innocence is, in a sense, the resource being consumed by the action of the show. Every adventure makes them slightly older. Every loss makes them slightly less of who they were. And by the end of the series, the twins are not the children they were at the start. They are, on the calendar, only a few months older. They are, in every meaningful sense, much further from the children they were in the first episode. The paradox is the strange grief that watching this produces in the audience. You are not supposed to grieve for a fictional child. The child does not exist, and yet the way the show frames the growing of Dipper and Mabel makes their growing feel like a small, ongoing loss. And the paradox is that the show seems to understand this and to be willing to sit with it. Childhood in Gravity Falls is not a state. It is a substance that is being slowly used up. By the end, the substance is gone, and what is left is the people the children have become. The show treats this as something to celebrate. It is also, very honestly, something to mourn, and the paradox is the way the show holds both feelings at once. The 99th paradox is the way the show treats adulthood. The older characters in Gravity Falls, the Stans, the Soos, the McGucket, the various adults of the town, are, on the surface, comic, and yet the show, on closer reading, treats them with an unusual seriousness. They are people who have lost things, who have failed at things, who have done things they cannot quite forgive themselves for, who carry on anyway. The paradox is the show's willingness to give adult sadness equal weight with child wonder, to make Stanley's 30-year vigil as central to the story as Dipper's 12-year-old anxieties. Most children's cartoons do not do this. Most of them treat adulthood as either a void or a punchline. Gravity Falls treats it as a continued state of being a person, and the paradox is the way this enlarges the show. You watch the twins, you root for them, you grow with them, and you also begin, somewhere in the middle of the series, to see the adults around them as people who used to be children, who once made choices that mattered, who are now living inside those choices. The paradox is that the show has time for both. It is, in this sense, a story about everyone in it, and that is one of the things that makes it last. There is a paradox in the way the show treats objects that are out of place. The Mystery Shack contains, in various scenes, items that should not be there, items from other dimensions, items that Stanford brought back, items that Stanley acquired through unclear means, items that the magic of the area has caused to drift in over the years. The paradox is the way the show treats these as background. A small piece of impossible glass is sitting on a shelf. A jar of something that should not exist is in the kitchen. A book bound in a substance you cannot quite identify is propping up a desk. The show does not draw attention to these, and the audience, watching, mostly does not notice. The paradox is the way the world of the show is full to the brim with quietly impossible items, and the way the household has absorbed them all into the texture of ordinary life. The implication is that, in Gravity Falls, the strange becomes domestic. The thing you would have called a miracle in any other setting is, in this house, just something on a shelf next to a coffee mug. The paradox is the rapid normalization of wonder, and the way the show argues that this is what any sufficiently long exposure to strangeness does to a person. You stop noticing. The miracles do not stop. You stop counting them. There is a paradox in the way the show structures its title sequence. The opening, played at the start of most episodes, is a fast, deliberately disorienting collage of imagery that includes glimpses of creatures and events that, in many cases, the series has not yet shown you. The paradox is the show's choice to spoil itself in shorthand at the start of every viewing. Many of the most important visual elements of the eventual mythology are visible, in microform, in the title sequence from the very first episode. The eye in the triangle, the forest, the strange creatures. The paradox is that the show is telling you, every time you press play, that it has been planning this. The lore is not improvised. The mythology is not a late addition. The pieces have been on screen, in summary, from the beginning, and the long arc of the series is, in a sense, an unfolding of an image that was always already there. The paradox is that you have been being warned for the entire show. You just did not, at first, know what you were being warned about. There is a paradox in the way the show treats first viewings. The series is designed to reward rewatching in a way that few other shows of its era attempt. Almost every episode contains, hidden in the background, references to events that have not yet happened. Posters predict future episodes. Background characters foreshadow major reveals. Throwaway lines turn out to have been hints. The paradox is that the first watch and the second watch are, in a sense, different shows. On a first watch, the audience sees the surface plot. On a second watch, the audience sees the surface plot and the long network of buried hints, and the experience is qualitatively richer. The paradox is the way this rewards loyalty without punishing it. A first-time viewer is not, on a first watch, missing anything that prevents them from enjoying the show. The story works as a story, but a rewatcher gets a second show on top of the first, a show full of small, invisible threads tying everything together. And the paradox is the generosity of building this second show into the production. Most series do not do this. They use their resources on the first impression. Gravity Falls used a significant chunk of its resources on the second. There is a paradox in the way the show handles its own emotional climaxes. The biggest moments in the series, the reveal of Stanford's identity, the rescue at the end of the second season, the final goodbye on the bus, are not staged with the kind of overheated music and slow motion that other series would have used. They are staged quietly. The score is restrained. The framing is gentle. The performances are dialed down rather than up. The paradox is the way the show, given the opportunity to make its biggest moments enormous, makes them small instead. The implication is that the writers and the directors trusted the moments themselves to carry the weight, that they did not need the production to underline them. The paradox is that this restraint is part of why the moments land. The bus pulls away, the music is small, the children are sleeping, and the absence of bombast is the thing that lets the moment in. If the show had insisted on the moment, the audience would have resisted it. By letting it be quiet, the show let the audience do the feeling itself, and the moment becomes, in the watching, larger than any louder version of it could have been. There is, in the middle of the series, a small recurring set of details around the Pines family's relationship to luck and to coincidence, and these compose a paradox of their own. Stanley believes himself to be unlucky. Stanford believes himself to be cursed. Their parents, in flashback, are shown to have been disappointed in them in different ways. And yet, in the long arc of the series, the family's luck turns out to be considerably better than either brother believed. They survive. They reunite. They are loved. The paradox is the gap between how the brothers describe their own histories and how those histories actually run. The Stans in this reading have spent decades narrating their lives as misfortune, while the same lives have been quietly accumulating a different kind of arc underneath the narration, an arc in which they ended up where they needed to end up, with the people they needed to end up with. The paradox is that the bad luck was, in retrospect, also the route. There is no path through the show that gets Stanley and Stanford onto the Stan War together without all of the worst things in their lives having happened first. The show is offering here a quiet idea about retrospect, that the parts of your life that felt most like punishment may turn out, on a long enough view, to have been the parts that got you somewhere worth arriving at. The paradox is that you do not get to know this while it is happening. You only get to know it later, if you live long enough to look back. There is also a separate paradox in the way the show treats Wendy. Wendy is Dipper's first major crush, an older girl who works at the Mystery Shack, and across the first season the show invests a great deal of emotional weight in Dipper's feelings for her. The paradox is what the show decides to do with those feelings in the second season. It does not let Dipper get the girl. It does not let Wendy fall in love with him. It does not even, in any cruel way, reject him. The show, with unusual maturity, simply lets the situation be what it is. Dipper is 12, Wendy is 15. There is no version of their story that is good for either of them, in which they become a couple, and the show has grown up enough to know that. The paradox is that the friendship survives the not getting. Dipper accepts that he is not going to be with Wendy. Wendy accepts that he had a crush on her and treats him with care about it, and they end the series as friends. That is, in television terms, an unusual thing to do. Most shows of this kind end up either rewarding the crush or punishing it. Gravity Falls does neither. It simply lets the crush exist as part of the boy's life and then moves him gently past it. And the paradox is the wisdom of the choice. The show is treating a child's first big feeling with the seriousness it deserves and the proportion it deserves at the same time. There is a paradox in the way the show treats laughter. Almost every episode is funny. Almost every episode also contains, near its center, something that, if you stop to think about it, would be quietly horrifying. The wax figures are coming to life and trying to murder the family. The town is full of small creatures whose biology is impossible. The dream world is real and other beings live in it. The portal in the basement is a door into worlds whose contents have been driving men mad. And yet the prevailing tone of the show, on any given minute, is light. The paradox is the way comedy and dread share the same frame. The way the show is genuinely funny while being, underneath, one of the more existentially uncomfortable shows on its network. The implication is that the only way to live in a world this strange is to laugh at it. The characters in Gravity Falls laugh because the alternative is to be paralyzed by what they have seen. The audience laughs because the alternative is to admit that the things they are seeing are, on a deep level, terrifying. The paradox is the strange utility of humor as a survival mechanism in a place like Gravity Falls, and the way the show treats jokes as not less serious than its mysteries, but, in some ways, as the only response to them that a person can sustain. There is a paradox in the show's relationship to its own merchandising. Across the run of the series, Stanley sells, inside the show, a vast catalog of bad merchandise from the Mystery Shack, all of which is presented as cheap, low quality, and obviously a tourist scam. And yet, in the real world, the show's merchandise has been beautifully designed, full of replicas of the journals, replicas of Bill's design, careful tributes to the show's visual language, exactly the kind of objects that Stanley, inside the show, would not have been allowed to produce. The paradox is the inversion between the on-screen presentation of merchandise and the real-world treatment of it. The show makes fun of its own merchandising while, in fact, producing some of the better-designed merchandise of any animated series of its era. The implication is that the show is operating on two levels at once, that it is mocking the very industry it depends on, and that this is, in some way, the right tonal stance for it to have. Gravity Falls knows it is a product. It is also, simultaneously, more than a product. The paradox is the way it lives in both states at once, and the way the bad merchandise inside the show is, in retrospect, a kind of cover story for the careful objects the real audience would eventually be offered. The 100th paradox is the show itself. Gravity Falls, considered as an object, is a children's animated television series that aired on Disney Channel and Disney XD across 2 seasons between 2012 and 2016, produced and largely written by a small team led by Alex Hirsch, made of 40 main episodes and assorted shorts, telling the story of a single summer in a small Oregon town. That is the literal description. The paradox is the gap between the literal description and the thing the show actually is. The thing the show actually is, for the people who love it, is a piece of work that contains, inside its small frame, a treatise on time, a treatise on memory, a treatise on family, a treatise on the difference between the persona you wear and the person you are. A long meditation on how a child becomes a person. A long meditation on how a person becomes themselves again after they have lost themselves. An essay on belief. An essay on attention. And a quietly devastating argument that the most important things in your life are the people you choose to come back to. None of that is on the box. None of that is in the synopsis. The paradox is that all of it is in the show. It is the largest of the paradoxes, the one that contains all the others. A small object, this small, this carefully made, that holds inside it a world this large, is, by any reasonable measure, impossible. The fact that the show exists at all is the central paradox of the show, and there is no way to resolve it except to keep returning to the work and seeing whether it is, on each new visit, still as large as you remember it being. It is, every time. That is the paradox at the center, and it is the one the show was always pointing at. There is something that happens at the end of any long look at a piece of work this dense, which is the realization that, no matter how many paradoxes you have listed, there are more, and the more is the part of the show you cannot quite name. The objects in Gravity Falls keep meaning more things the longer you look at them, and the people in it keep being slightly larger than the screen has room for, and the world around them keeps suggesting other worlds. The show is, in this sense, doing exactly the thing the author's journals were doing inside the show. It is offering you a partial map of a much larger place, and the partial map is, on its own terms, complete. You can put the journal down, you can put the show down. You will not see the whole place, because nobody is going to see the whole place, but the part of it the show is showing you is, by any reasonable measure, enough. There is a small sadness that comes with the end of any rewatch of the series, and the paradox of that sadness is that it is, somehow, what the show was preparing you for. The show is, from its first frame, telling you that the summer is going to end. The kids tell you. The credits tell you. The hidden codes tell you. The strange clocks in the background tell you. By the time the bus pulls away in the final episode, you have been warned, in dozens of small ways, that this is coming, and the warning does not soften the moment. The bus pulls away. The town shrinks. The twins are sleeping on each other's shoulders. The shack is shrinking in the distance, and the music underneath is the music that has been playing throughout the show, in fragments and reprises and quiet placements, and the music says, finally, what the show has been saying the whole time, which is that the summer was real, that the people were real, that the things that happened mattered, and that they have all ended, and that the ending is, somehow, all right. Gravity Falls remains, more than a decade after its conclusion, one of the most beloved animated television series of its era, and the reason for that, in the end, is not its time travel, or its codes, or its monster of the week structure, or its careful build of a long-term mythology. Though all of those things are good, the reason is the quiet seriousness with which the show treats the small things. The seriousness it gives to a great uncle who is hiding his real feelings under 30 years of bad jokes. The seriousness it gives to a girl who is afraid of growing up. The seriousness it gives to a boy who is afraid of being lonely. The seriousness it gives to an old man who has lost himself in a memory gun. The seriousness it gives to a beleaguered handyman trying to be a good person without anybody noticing. The paradoxes in the show are the show's bones, but the show's body is made of these small acts of attention to people who, in another work, might not have received any. That is what people are responding to when they go on loving the show many years later. It is not the puzzle. It is the kindness underneath the puzzle, the way the show treats almost every character in it as if they deserve to be looked at carefully, the way it refuses to leave anyone behind. That is rare. That is what made the show what it is, and that is what the show, in its quiet way, is asking you to take with you when you turn it off. If you have followed me this far, all the way through every paradox of a small town in Oregon and the family that lives in it, then thank you for listening. The format of these videos is a long one on purpose. It is meant to drift past you the way a current does, to give you something to put your head down to give you a voice in the dark that is doing one thing slowly and well. I hope the show, on the next time you watch it, is even slightly larger to you than it was before. I hope